Samwell Tarly had never thought of himself as a man who would tread into the darker arts. He had once been a timid boy, afraid of ghosts and ghouls, teased by his brothers at the wall for his soft heart and quivering knees. Books had become his refuge, an escape from jeering mouths, an honest way to glean knowledge and bring something useful to the night's watch. But fate, for all its inscrutability, began to guide his path the moment he left the wall for the citadel. There, in the cavernous library brimming with scrolls and tomes older than any living memory, Sam found comfort in the silent company of books. Their pages never judged him. Instead, they shared secrets, offered ideas, and whispered about truths better left hidden. He had not meant to go searching for the secrets of raising the dead. Far from it. He was, by nature, reluctant to meddle with any kind of magic, especially dark magic. Yet late nights turned into early mornings, his eyes red from poring over knowledge that stretched back to the Age of Heroes. Most of what he read concerned the Long Night, the White Walkers, and the looming threat to Westeros. It was all he could do, he told himself, to help his friends at the Wall, to help Jon, to protect Gilly and Little Sam. The White Walkers would not stop simply because men pretended they weren't real. He believed, more fiercely every day, that there was something in those old tomes, some vital secret or some hidden key, that could help men fight back and survive. In truth, what Sam discovered was more horrifying than anything he could have anticipated. Under layers of crumbling parchment, pressed between histories of the Valyrian freehold and treatises on the higher mysteries, he unearthed a shadow-bound volume with no known author. The text was written in spidery letters, each page covered with warnings and incantations, each line hinting at powers that had once made the dead walk at the command of mortal men. Though most of it seemed half-mad ramblings, or so Sam told himself, curiosity bit at him like winter wind. He read and reread, deciphering archaic High Valyrian phrases and ancient dialects from the Shadowlands beyond Ass High. Buried in the text were references to necromancy. He was horrified. Sam shut the book every time an image of corpses shambling under his command leapt into his mind. But whenever he tried to cast it from his thoughts, his studies of the White Walkers reminded him that the dead already walked in the north, that the others were raising whites to tear apart the realms of men. Could there be a use, he wondered, in discovering how such magic worked? Was there a way that knowledge might aid their struggle? Could harnessing such a terrifying power be turned against the Great Other, or against the White Walkers themselves? He faced tormenting nights, staring at the flickering candlelight, unable to sleep. The idea gnawed on him, especially as he considered his friend Jon Snow at the Wall, or wherever Jon might be now, perhaps beyond it, riding with Tormund Giantsbane, or struggling to unite the North. If necromancy could be used to create an army of the dead, was it truly so different from what the White Walkers were doing? Yet men had once harnessed the powers of dragons. Men had once shaped entire continents through fire and blood. Had they not? He rationalized that knowledge, once gained, could be used for good or ill. It was up to the user to decide how to wield it. And Sam knew in his heart that he was a good man. He told himself that if he discovered something monstrous, he would never let it be used for evil. But curiosity is a ravenous beast. No chain that Sam might forge in the Citadel could keep him from opening that book again. On a night blacker than the vilest rumors from old Valyria, Sam found himself hunched over a lone candle, reading passages penned in a style so archaic he almost believed it was pre-Valyrian. His fingers trembled on each page. The instructions were cryptic, describing rites beneath a moonless sky, the scattering of bone dust, the chanting of words that had not been spoken aloud in centuries. He told himself it was merely academic. He pictured Archmaester Ibroz or any of the others praising his diligence in uncovering old lore. He dreamed of how such knowledge might be turned into a weapon against the White Walkers. Perhaps there was a method to unbind their hold over whites, or to protect men from being raised once they died. Yes, that was how he justified it. To unravel the White Walkers' secrets, one had to know the spells they twisted to their own ends. Once discovered, Sam reasoned that power could be undone. But the deeper he went, the more darkness seemed to loom in his mind. Small shadows began to gather in the corners of his room, flickering at the edge of his vision. He sometimes felt an odd chill creeping across the back of his neck, like a silent watcher standing just behind him. The words in the book seemed to pulse, almost alive, on the pages. A single droplet of ink on the margin would look to him like blood. He told no one. Maester after maester walked the halls, novices and acolytes dozed in the library. But Sam held this secret in his heart. He began small. The text mentioned a series of rites meant to stir minor spirits, not the bodies of men. In the depths of a hidden storeroom behind the library's restricted section, Sam found the dusty remains of a crow that might have died decades ago. Its brittle bones and scraps of feathers were left in a box with old samples meant for dissection or demonstration. With shaking hands, Sam arranged the tiny skeleton on a stone table, lighting a single candle. He chanted the arcane phrases from memory, for fear that reading them aloud from the text might somehow taint the citadel's very air. His voice quivered on the final syllables. Nothing happened. He let out a held breath, torn between relief and disappointment. When Sam tried again a few nights later, he used a pinch of crushed weirwood bark, having recalled some reference to the old god's power. This time, as he spoke the last word, a fleeting wind seemed to blow through the sealed storeroom, carrying the dust away from the crow's bones in a swirl. He heard a faint caw, or perhaps he only imagined it. The candle flickered out. In total darkness, Sam's heart pounded like a war drum. He felt something pass behind him, as if a ghostly wing brushed the nape of his neck. And then nothing. When he lit the candle again, the bones lay scattered. He carefully packed them back into the box and left, his mind reeling with confusion and dread. Yet the mere hint that the old magic might be real both terrified and fascinated Sam. Over the following weeks, he continued his studies. He found more references in other volumes, allusions to Shadowbinders in Ashai, cryptic mentions of the Bloodstone Emperor in E.T., fragments of scattered lore that each had their own version of men raising the dead for unholy wars. Always, Sam tried to keep in mind that he only sought knowledge to be used against the White Walkers. Sometimes, he would recall the terror he felt when he first saw an other beyond the wall, how that creature's glowing blue eyes had nearly turned him to ice. If he could find a way to break their hold on the dead, or wrest the ability away from them, at times he almost convinced himself it was truly the right thing to do. Yet every foray deeper into that black tome made him feel unclean, as though invisible hands were sliding across his shoulders whenever he read it. The nights were pitch dark, clouds covering the moon. He took care to keep Gilly ignorant of his doings. She had come with him to Old Town for safety, along with the babe, and though the citadel was far from welcoming to a woman, especially a wildling, Sam had found them lodging close by. He loved her. He would have done anything to keep her safe. The knowledge that the White Walkers threatened everything spurred him on, fueling the fire that drove him deeper into the dangerous corners of lost lore. It happened by chance that Sam discovered a hidden catacomb beneath an old, unused wing of the citadel. He was chasing a rumor of secret vaults, places where maesters of old had locked away knowledge deemed too dangerous for the common man. He crawled through a tight corridor behind the foundation, nearly getting stuck. Beyond, he found a half-collapsed staircase leading down into musty darkness. After lighting a torch, he ventured below to discover an ancient crypt that smelled of mold and old parchment. Broken chests lay scattered, along with tarnished ceremonial pieces and fragments of bone that might have belonged to animals. He hoped they were animal bones. In a corner, piled haphazardly, were the remains of men. Sam's torchlight revealed about a dozen skeletons, each seemingly cast aside without ceremony. Some wore tattered scraps of robes that could have once belonged to maesters, or novices, or perhaps intruders. He would never know, but the Black Tome's instructions rang in his head. Here was a chance to prove whether the necromantic rites might truly raise the dead. Fear clutched him. He almost turned and fled, telling himself that the very thought was obscene. But Sam realized there, in that moment, that if he could raise even one skeleton under his command, he might glean how the White Walkers did it, and thus how to stop them. His breath caught in his throat. He crouched beside the bones, laid out a pattern in the dust as the cryptic instructions demanded. He sprinkled a powder he had prepared, an odd blend of weirwood shavings, a pinch of dragonglass dust, and other items gleaned from obscure references. Then he spoke the words. His voice reverberated off the stone walls, sounding stronger than he had expected. As if another presence echoed his chant from behind him, the torchlight dimmed. The darkness of the catacomb seemed to swell, inhaling his fear, exhaling an aura of cold that sank into Sam's bones. When he ended the incantation, his voice broke. The last syllable resounded in the chamber, coiling through the stale air. At first, the skeleton before him did not stir. Minutes stretched like hours. Sam's knees ached from crouching, and his heart hammered until he thought he might faint. Just when he was about to reach for the torch and stumble out, he heard the scraping of bone on stone. His eyes snapped down. A bony hand twitched, fingers flexed. Bit by bit, it lifted itself from the ground, the jawbone grinding as if trying to speak. The torch in Sam's grip sputtered. His breath caught in his chest. He felt sure he would scream, but no sound came forth. The skeleton's empty eye sockets turned toward him. For a moment, Sam was paralyzed by dread and something else. An inexplicable wonder. He had done it. His incantation had worked. Cold sweat trickled down his forehead. He willed himself to speak, to utter a command, but he realized he didn't know what to say. The skeleton shifted upright, rattling with each move. Instinct alone made Sam croak out, "Stay!" The thing halted, half standing, cocking its skull as though struggling to interpret its master's word. Sam repeated, more firmly, "Stay." The skeleton froze. Then it collapsed, bones clattering into a heap. The entire event had lasted less than half a minute, yet it felt like a lifetime. Sam knelt there in the dark catacomb, torchlight guttering, uncertain whether to laugh, cry, or pray. Power coursed in his veins, dark and heady, mingling with guilt and revulsion. He tried to calm his trembling hands, but a flood of realization crashed into him. What he had just done was unnatural, heretical. Maesters had sought for centuries to keep such knowledge contained for good reason. And yet, part of him, shakily, quietly, found hope. If he could truly command the dead, might he raise them against the White Walkers? Make them fight the Whites? Was that even possible? The next few weeks saw Sam repeating the experiment in secret, always descending to that crypt, always careful to avoid detection by day. He refined the incantation, reading more closely from the black tome, adjusting his offerings and words. Each time, the skeleton rose a little more promptly, stood a little more steadily. Sometimes, he ventured to command it to walk a step or two. He nearly panicked when one obeyed him, clattering across the stone floor, only to trip on a chunk of rubble and fall apart. Through trial and error, Sam discovered certain wards must be carved into the bones themselves or at least traced upon them with blood to strengthen the binding. He found references to the concept of binding an undead with a piece of the summoner's own life force, hair, blood, even breath. He dared not try anything so extreme. Instead, he relied on the simplest forms he could glean. Despite all caution, each foray deeper into the black arts eroded Sam's sense of self. He began sleeping less and less, dozing fitfully at a desk heaped with dusty scrolls. His mind constantly raced. Each time he heard the shuffle of a maester's robes in the hall, or the squeak of boots on floorboards, he imagined they came for him, that they somehow knew the abomination he was conducting in secret. But the days passed without confrontation. The maesters were too busy, too absorbed in other pursuits, and the novices lived their own trivial dramas. Sam's disquiet gave him an almost feverish determination to glean all he could. One evening, Gilly found him in the library, where he had dozed off over a particularly old volume. The black tome was hidden away in his satchel, carefully wrapped. She touched his shoulder gently, her voice warm, concerned. "Sam, are you all right?" He jerked awake, eyes wild, and saw her startled expression. Her lips parted in worry. She asked if he was ill. He tried to reassure her, but she saw the shadows under his eyes, the lingering terror in his gaze. She pressed him, but he refused to speak the truth. She knew something was wrong, but she trusted him enough not to pry too deeply. Sam's heart twisted with guilt. She had endured so much already, from Craster's keep to the harrowing journey south. He hated that he was hiding something so monstrous from her. Yet, if he told her, she might recoil in horror or run for fear, or worse, someone might overhear. As he resumed his clandestine necromantic experiments, Sam discovered a potent aspect of this dark art. The necromancer's will was everything. It was not enough to utter words. The summoner had to believe, had to exert dominance over death itself. That strain weighed on him. Some nights, he felt an oppressive presence pressing down upon his spirit, as though the crypt had become a conduit for ancient powers that demanded a price. At times, his reflection in a half-burnished dish frightened him. His eyes seemed sunken, ringed by shadows. Yet success, once tasted, is hard to forsake. He began practicing with more skeletons at once, commanding 2 or 3. The rattling echo of bone on stone in the catacomb made him shudder. But he pressed on because each success proved the possibility. If a few skeletons could be made to follow commands, then an entire legion might one day be raised. Perhaps that legion could stand against the whites. Sam did not dare attempt to raise fresh corpses. The very notion turned his stomach, and besides, he had read that newly dead bodies required more complicated rituals, often tethered to foul ingredients he could not easily obtain. The price of his efforts soon became apparent. Nightmares haunted him. He dreamt of the crypt skeletons rising up on their own, turning on him, clawing his flesh. He saw visions of the others, tall and gaunt, riding dead horses across the sky, beckoning him to join them. On waking, drenched in sweat, Sam would vow to burn that accursed tome. Yet by daylight, he would rationalize again, telling himself that if he stopped now, all he had gained might be lost forever, knowledge that might be Westeros's last hope. He told himself he could stop once he knew enough to ensure victory against the White Walkers. Then came the day that everything changed. He had gone to the catacomb as usual, carrying a sack of scraps that might suffice as an offering. He planned to attempt commanding the raised skeletons to undertake a simple task: carry a box from one side of the crypt to the other. If he could make them coordinate, move as a unit, perhaps that would show him whether an undead army might ever fight in formation. The air was colder than usual, the dust on the steps coated in a thin layer of condensation. His torch sputtered unsteadily as he descended, as though invisible lips tried to blow it out. He arrived to find a figure standing in the darkness. A tall, lean man draped in the robes of a maester. The cowl concealed most of the man's face, but Sam glimpsed a stern, bearded mouth twisting with disapproval. Sam almost dropped the torch. He recognized the chain around the man's neck, glinting faintly in the flickering light. This was Archmaester Marwyn, rumored to be the most unconventional and least trusted of the high-ranking maesters. Marwyn called Sam by name, and Sam's voice caught in his throat. Marwyn asked how far Sam had gone down this path, how many times he had uttered those forbidden words. Sam stammered denials, half-lies, but the Archmaester cut through them. He said he had felt the tremors in the air, the disruptions in the Citadel's wards. He knew that some ancient magic was being stirred here in the catacomb. Then, to Sam's astonishment, Marwyn did not call for the guards or threaten to have him expelled. Instead, he demanded that Sam show him what he could do. Trembling, Sam realized that perhaps Marwyn was not an ordinary maester, for the rumors spoke of him dabbling in the higher mysteries, having traveled to Ashai and beyond in search of knowledge. And so Sam, uncertain and terrified, complied. He lit another torch and carefully performed the rite. Marwyn stood watch, silent except for a faint glimmer of interest in his eyes. The skeleton twitched to life, rose, obeyed Sam's command to walk across the crypt. When it was done, Sam spoke the dismissal words, and the skeleton collapsed. Silence pressed down upon them. The Archmaester regarded him with a mix of fascination and caution. Marwyn spoke in a low tone, warning Sam that if the other maesters discovered this, they would destroy him. They might even destroy Gilly, to bury all traces of such a scandal. The Citadel had no love for unbridled sorcery. But Marwyn, to Sam's surprise, did not seem entirely opposed to using this power. He told Sam that the threat in the north was real. He believed it, had always believed it, and that if Sam had the means to create an undead army loyal to men instead of the others, it might be the only salvation. Yet the Archmaester was no wide-eyed innocent. He warned Sam that such spells could warp a man's soul, draw the attention of dark entities. Sam, his voice shaking, insisted that he only wanted to help, to protect those he cared about. Marwyn nodded, but Sam could see in his eyes that the older man weighed his own agenda as well. A clandestine partnership formed that night. Together, they began to test the boundaries of the necromantic rites. Marwyn, who possessed knowledge gleaned from strange corners of the world, guided Sam through references in his black tome that Sam had only half understood. Some nights, they worked together in the crypt, performing incantations meant to strengthen the bond between Sam and the skeletons. Other nights, Marwyn left Sam instructions or old scrolls to study, hinting at rituals that might animate fresher bodies. Sam recoiled from that notion. He was not willing to plunder graveyards or worse. Still, a part of him was morbidly curious. Whether fresh corpses retained more ability, perhaps the use of muscle tissue that skeletons lacked. For a time, Sam convinced himself that under Marwyn's watch, this was all for a greater good. With Marwyn's cunning, they would keep their experiments hidden from the other Archmaesters. They would refine a method to safely raise and command the dead. Then, when the White Walkers inevitably came, they would stand ready. Word from the north was patchy. Ravens came bearing uncertain tidings about castle after castle emptying, wildlings crossing through the wall, rumors of skirmishes with the others beyond the gift. Every snippet of grim news seemed to drive Sam deeper into the dark, fueling him with the justification that if the rest of Westeros refused to acknowledge the threat, it was up to him to forge a solution. But the line between forging a solution and forging a nightmare was thinner than Sam ever realized. The catacomb became an unholy laboratory of sorts. He had raised well over a dozen skeletons by now, never all at once for fear of losing control, and each time he did so, he sensed something intangible stirring in the shadows. Marwyn said little about that presence, though Sam suspected the older man felt it too. And then, late one night, they attempted something that neither had dared speak of before, reanimating the body of a long-dead novice whose remains they discovered sealed in a hidden niche. The young man had apparently died of a wasting sickness decades ago, and for whatever reason, had been placed in a secret crypt rather than receiving a proper burial. The body was mostly bones and leathery remnants of flesh. It was far from fresh, but it was more intact than the ancient skeleton Sam had used previously. Marwyn insisted that such a test was necessary. Sam's stomach churned at the sight of the corpse, the stretched skin over its skull, the shriveled remains of eyes. But he had come too far, told himself that the importance of knowledge outweighed his horror. Marwyn drew a circle around the corpse with chalk, embedding it with runes Sam had only half read about. The Archmaester bade Sam to cut his finger and let a single drop of blood fall upon the corpse's chest. Sam hesitated, but Marwyn's stare was unyielding. With trembling hands, Sam pricked his finger. A fat droplet of blood fell, staining the withered flesh. As Sam chanted the incantation, the torches seemed to dim as though the darkness was devouring their light. A static charge built in the air, causing the hair on Sam's arms to stand upright. When the final word left his lips, a dreadful hush fell. The corpse jerked, its limbs spasming with unnatural life. Sam's heart thundered in his chest. He instinctively took a step back. The body arched its spine, a hollow gasp rattling from its throat. It began to rise, its joints creaking with the dryness of old leather. Sam felt the urge to run. He forced himself to speak a command. "Stand." The revenant stood on shaking legs, head lolling to one side. Its lips, dry and cracked, parted in a silent moan. Sam forced himself not to retch. Marwyn watched with wide eyes, at once enthralled and horrified. Then, in a voice that almost didn't sound like Sam's own, he gave another command, "Walk." The thing shuffled forward, dragging its feet. A wave of revulsion rippled through Sam. The smell of rot drifted in the stale air. It took only a few steps, but each rattled Sam's nerve. Fear pulsed through him, but overshadowing it was a triumph that he desperately tried to tamp down. This was no mere skeleton. This was a corpse that could follow commands more precisely. The presence in the shadows seemed to pulse. Sam's head spun. Something intangible pressed at the edges of his mind, as though trying to slip inside. He had to concentrate to maintain control over the corpse. At Marwyn's nod, Sam spoke the dismissal words. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the corpse collapsed in a heap of rotted flesh and bones. Sam sagged to his knees, panting, sweat-drenched. A small laugh, half hysterical, escaped his lips. Marwyn stood there, silent, his expression grave. Sam realized that the Archmaester's hand was clenched around a small iron talisman that he'd never seen him use before. Perhaps Marwyn was safeguarding himself from whatever forces Sam had just invoked. Things escalated from there. Not all at once, but steadily in small increments. Sam found himself returning to that crypt to refine the spells. Marwyn became more demanding, pushing Sam to attempt new incantations, new ways of binding the dead. A sense of gloom clung to Sam's spirit, as though each success weighed him down with an invisible chain. He found it harder to smile for Gilly, harder to cradle little Sam with genuine warmth. He feared that if he did not complete this work, Westeros would be doomed, and yet part of him wondered if he was dooming himself in the process. Eventually, rumors reached them that the others were moving south of the wall in larger numbers, that the Night King, if such a being truly existed, was mustering an unstoppable army of whites. Sam's terror soared. He saw no alternative but to press on and master the necromancy. He reasoned that if the White Walkers had 100,000 whites, men needed 100,000 more. And so, behind the veil of secrecy, Sam studied how to raise multiple bodies at once. No longer content with the bare skeletons, he began slipping out at night to scavenge paupers' graves on the outskirts of Old Town, cursing himself each time yet feeling a frantic compulsion. He told himself these were unclaimed corpses, poor souls with no family, no one to mourn them. In some twisted corner of his mind, he believed he was giving them a chance to fight for the living. It helped him sleep, though barely. Grave by grave, Sam tested his incantations, braving the stench of decay and the crawling sensation that he was being watched by some ancient power. Often, Marwyn accompanied him, ensuring no one else witnessed their crimes. The Archmaester taught Sam better ways to ward off the malignant spirits that might seep through the cracks of the ritual. Together, they reanimated more bodies, commanding them to stand, to march, to lift torches or spades. With each attempt, Sam felt a subtle draining of his own vitality. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his once plump figure began to wither. He tried to eat more to stave off the exhaustion, but it made little difference. Each incantation took a piece of him, yet he refused to stop. One bleak morning, after a particularly harrowing night of raising half a dozen corpses from a mass grave, Sam returned to Gilly's lodging just before dawn. He found her awake, pacing nervously, tears in her eyes. She asked him where he had been, why he always disappeared at night, why the smell of decay clung to him. She begged him to confide in her. Sam's heart broke. He almost confessed everything, but fear silenced him. He offered her a weak reassurance that he was doing what he must to protect them. He thought of how Gilly once said she believed in him, trusted him. How could she continue to trust him if she learned what monstrous acts he was committing? Her tears stained his conscience, but he knew it was too late to stop. The threat of the White Walkers, the urgency of forging an undead force for men, overshadowed any second thoughts he might harbor. He told himself that once the others were defeated, he would find a way to cleanse his soul. But the darkness does not release its hold so easily. At last, Marwyn told Sam they needed to move beyond merely raising small batches of corpses. They had to prove if large-scale necromancy was possible. They had to test if an army could indeed be forged. The Archmaester revealed that deep in the catacombs beneath the High Tower, below even the foundation of Old Town, lay ancient vaults rumored to contain the bones of thousands. Legends said that in ages past, when plagues swept the land, the dead were dumped beneath the city. Sam's stomach churned at the thought of disturbing such a place. But that same kernel of compulsion flared. If it worked, if they could raise enough bodies. The plan was madness, Sam knew. But the days were growing shorter. He had read the scattered accounts of cold winds sweeping down from the shivering sea, as if presaging the White Walker's approach. Time was against them. With trembling resolve, Sam prepared. He spent a week reading the Black Tome's passages on mass rites. In secret, he drew sigils on large sheets of parchment that Marwyn would help him place in the vault. He prepared jars of potions whose foul odor made him gag. He even etched lines from the incantation onto a slim rod of weirwood, hoping it might channel the old god's power. Or was it the old gods at all that he was calling upon? When the appointed night arrived, the sky was moonless, clouds smothering any starlight. Sam and Marwyn stole into the depths beneath Old Town, winding through passages so ancient they crumbled at the edges. The deeper they went, the thicker the air became with dust and the stench of centuries-old death. At last, they arrived at a vast cavern, partially hewn out of bedrock, partially braced by massive, rotting beams. By torchlight, Sam could see piles of bones stretching out in the darkness. Legs, arms, skulls, ribs, countless remains of the nameless dead. Terror almost made him flee, yet he steeled himself, reminding himself of the threat beyond the wall. He and Marwyn set out the sigils, placing them on the ground according to an intricate pattern. With careful steps, they poured the potions into shallow grooves scratched into the stone. The stench became overwhelming, and Sam's head swam. Finally, they stood at the center of the arrangement, a circle of runes drawn around them. Marwyn handed Sam a small dagger. "A few drops of your blood," the Archmaester said quietly, "and then speak the words." Sam hesitated, hearing Gilly's voice in his mind, seeing her tears. He recalled the White Walkers, too, and the vow he had taken to protect the realms of men. This, he told himself, was for the greater good. He sliced his palm, wincing at the sting, letting the blood drip onto the stone. Then he lifted the black tome in his other hand and began to chant. The words felt heavier, more alive than ever before. Darkness churned in the corners of the cavern as the torches sputtered. He felt the presence that had haunted him in the crypt, looming larger, as though it had grown each time he used its power. The sound of rattling echoed through the vault. Sam forced himself to keep chanting, despite the cold fear rising in his throat. Bones began to shift, entire piles stirring like seas of ivory. Marwyn stood beside Sam, eyes wide, clutching that iron talisman in his fist. The volume of clattering increased, joined by the hollow echo of skulls rolling across the floor. Sam's chant reached a crescendo, each word burning his throat. A wave of dizziness hit him, and he felt an unholy force pouring from him into the swirling bones. Across the cavern, scattered forms began to assemble. Arms found torsos, legs locked into sockets. Lopsided skeletons rose, some with missing ribs or incomplete limbs, yet still they staggered upright. The clattering of thousands of bones was deafening. Sam's vision blurred. Sweat poured down his brow, mixing with blood from his palm. He sensed that if he faltered, the force he had unleashed would turn on him. So he gathered the last reserves of his willpower and uttered the final phrase. A shockwave rippled outward. Then there was silence, broken only by the faint drip of water in distant recesses. In the flickering torchlight, an army of bones stood facing Sam and Marwyn. Hundreds, maybe thousands of skeletal forms, each wearing the remnants of clothing long since decayed. Each pair of empty eye sockets locked onto the circle where Sam stood. Marwyn's voice shook with awe and fear as he whispered, "Command them." Sam's heart thundered. He coughed, tasting copper, and raised a trembling hand. "Kneel," he croaked. A multitude of bones clattered, a wave of rattling as, row by row, the skeletons dropped to one knee. Sam nearly collapsed with relief, but a new wave of dread replaced it. He had raised an army of the dead, a force that had no mind except for the force binding it to him. He felt their presence scraping at the edges of his consciousness, clamoring for direction, for purpose. He realized that controlling them would be an ongoing battle of will. Marwen's eyes gleamed in triumph. He placed a hand on Sam's shoulder and said, "This is our salvation. We will march them north. The White Walkers will find themselves facing an enemy they cannot so easily turn." Sam's chest felt tight. Marwen was right in theory. The White Walkers might not be able to raise these bones as their own whites if Sam's necromantic bond was stronger. But the horrifying sight of this bone legion, kneeling in the dark, turned Sam's blood to ice. What had he done? In the days that followed, the two conspirators scrambled to decide how to move such a colossal force without alerting half of Westeros. Marwen insisted that they must act before the maesters uncovered the truth. The Archmaester began forging documents, sending ravens under false pretenses to certain lords who might be sympathetic or too frightened to ask questions. Sam began to realize just how cunning Marwen was, how prepared. It unsettled him, but there was no time to question it. The bond with the undead horde pressed upon him constantly, like 1,000 invisible strings tugging at his mind. He found sleep nearly impossible. When he did close his eyes, he dreamt of black shadows, of a terrible voice calling from the frozen wastes, a voice that recognized the power Sam had wielded and called him to do more. Each morning, he woke with a sense of dread. Marwen arranged for a discreet route out of Old Town, using old smuggler paths by the waters. But even so, the challenge was immense. They could not simply walk thousands of skeletons through farmland unnoticed. The plan was to march them in small groups at night, converging at certain hidden locations, then eventually gather them into a single horde farther north, near the Reach's border. Sam parted from Gilly with a heavy heart, telling her he had urgent business for the Citadel. She begged him not to go, but he promised he would return. She pressed little Sam into his arms one last time, and Sam felt tears burn his eyes. But he left them behind for fear of the danger that might follow in his wake. He and Marwen oversaw the first wave of skeletons. Under cover of darkness, they led a column of the dead through old tunnels that emptied into the harbor's undercrofts. The sound of water lapping against stone mixed with the clatter of bones. Sam felt like a prisoner being marched by his own creations. If not for Marwen's illusions, small spells gleaned from shadow-binding lore, someone would surely have spotted them. The rotting stench of centuries-old remains was almost unbearable. Sam kept a cloth pressed to his nose, though it did little good. The skeletons trudged at a measured pace. The slightest misstep and they would tumble into the water and be lost. They had no minds of their own, no self-preservation, only the compulsion Sam commanded. The logistical nightmare pressed on for days, then weeks, as they established hidden camps in deserted fields or forgotten ruins. The hushed clatter of bones never ceased, driving Sam nearly mad. He found that the constant strain of maintaining control over such a vast undead host drained him physically and mentally. His skin took on a pallid hue, his hair thinner than before, and his clothes hung loose on his frame. He forced himself to eat and drink regularly, but each meal tasted like ash in his mouth. Marwen saw Sam's condition but urged him to hold on. Once they reached a place near the Rose Road, they could begin a more direct march north, avoiding major towns. Sam dreaded what would happen if an army of living soldiers confronted them. Would the skeletons mindlessly attack? Could Sam command them not to? He had no illusions that his undead legion would pass for anything but an abomination. If rumors spread that a horde of walking bones advanced on the Crownlands, chaos would erupt. He prayed that if they moved swiftly, they might slip by and reach the Stormlands or perhaps the Riverlands unnoticed. But it was a foolish hope. Their presence was discovered eventually by a band of hedge knights who stumbled on the undead encampment at twilight. The shrieking of terrified horses alerted the skeletons, and Sam felt the lurch of sudden conflict in his mind. He scrambled to maintain order, to keep the skeletons from scattering or attacking. But the knights, seeing the horrifying sight of dead men standing, panicked. One tried to charge in, sword raised. Sam shouted a command for the skeletons to hold position, but a few lurched forward. He realized with terror that the bond was fraying, perhaps because he was exhausted. Some skeletons froze, but others advanced, driven by the half-formed impetus in Sam's mind to defend themselves. A chaotic skirmish broke out. Bones clashed with steel. The hedge knights howled, spurring their mounts away, but not before one was dragged from his saddle by clutching skeletal hands. The unfortunate man's screams echoed as he was torn apart. Sam shouted, "Stop!" He poured all his will into halting the undead. A wave of mental force spread among the skeletons, and they fell still, their bony grips slackening. The knight's body tumbled to the ground, lifeless. The other knights, traumatized, spurred their horses and vanished into the dusk, no doubt to spread word of what they had witnessed. In the aftermath, Sam sank to his knees beside the torn corpse, horror clawing at his chest. This was not what he wanted. But the skeletons, soulless things, had no regard for the value of a life. Marwyn arrived, pale but composed, urging Sam to stand. He told Sam there was no time for remorse, that they had to move the Legion immediately before the local lord's men came after them in force. Sam stared at the blood-soaked earth and realized that he had crossed the line into atrocity. Still, he pressed on, guiding the undead further north, heartsick and numb. They traveled by night, resting by day in hidden glens or abandoned farms. Whispers circulated among the peasantry about an unholy army of bones haunting the countryside, though many dismissed it as nonsense or the ravings of frightened travelers. Then, not long after crossing the Mander, they were met by a small group of soldiers bearing the sigil of House Tarley, a striding huntsman on green. Sam's heart froze at the sight of his family's banner. These were presumably men sworn to his father's estate in the Reach, likely on patrol or escort duty. His father was dead, he had heard the rumors. Randall Tarley had been executed or burned by dragons, depending on which rumor one believed, after refusing to bend the knee to Daenerys Targaryen. Sam felt a pang of unresolved grief. Standing at the head of an undead host, confronted by men of House Tarley, twisted something deep inside him. Their leader recognized Sam even in the shadows. "Lord Samwell?" the soldier called, obviously perplexed. What is this?" He saw the legion of silent skeletons behind Sam, barely visible in the dimness. Sam tried to stammer out an explanation, but no words came. He saw fear in the soldier's eyes, a terrified understanding that something unnatural stood before him. Still, they did not immediately attack. Sam tried to gather himself to speak about the threat in the north, about how this undead army was meant to defend the realm. But his voice hook, his words disjointed. The soldier looked behind Sam to see a forest of unmoving bone shapes, and in that moment, the man made a decision. "Please," he said, "stay where you are. I must fetch the rest of the men." A flicker of pity crossed his face, as if he recognized that Sam was not the same frightened boy who had once left Horn Hill in disgrace, yet also not the same man. Then he turned to ride away. Marwyn hissed for Sam to command the skeletons to seize the soldier, but Sam refused. He was done killing needlessly. He let the soldier ride off, hoping that perhaps the next wave of men might be reasoned with. Marwyn cursed under his breath, but Sam's expression was grim. He said they would not kill House Tarley men. That was final. Marwyn's eyes were cold, but he did not press the issue. A hush fell over the undead ranks, the rattling of bones faint in the night wind. Before dawn, dozens of armed riders returned. This time, Sam recognized the figure at the front, astride a powerful bay horse. His younger brother, Dickon Tarley, though rumor said he too might have died with their father. Yet here he was, clad in partial plate, a sword at his side, flanked by men with lanterns held high, illuminating the horrors behind Sam. Dickon's face was grim as he reined in, taking in the sight of his elder brother standing among the dead, eyes ringed with exhaustion, a chain of maester's links half concealed beneath his cloak. "Samwell," Dickon said, voice tight with shock, "what have you done?" Sam opened his mouth, mind spinning. He remembered how Dickon had always overshadowed him, the favored son, brave, strong, everything Sam was not. Now Sam stood here commanding an army of walking corpses. Guilt, shame, and defiance warred within him. In halting words, Sam tried to explain about the White Walkers, about how they needed every advantage. He stuttered about how he had discovered ancient necromantic knowledge. The men behind Dickon muttered in fear. Dickon stared at the skeletons, eyes flicking to the battered armor some wore, ragged scraps from the graves Sam had plundered. "You've become a monster," Dickon whispered half to himself. Sam wanted to protest, but could he? He felt monstrous. He had stolen the sleep of the dead to raise them as weapons, had let a hedge knight die screaming in their clutches. When Sam did not deny it, Dickon's jaw tightened. He told Sam to surrender, to let the men of Horn Hill escort him somewhere safe, so that whatever madness possessed him could be stopped. Sam hung his head. He could see no easy solution, no path that did not lead to bloodshed or betrayal of his cause. Marwyn stepped forward, voice sharp, telling Dickon that Sam was the key to saving Westeros, that they would not surrender. He threatened to unleash the undead if Dickon tried to hinder them. Dickon's men braced themselves, brandishing weapons. Sam could practically taste the tension in the air. He knew what would happen if he let Marwyn proceed. Another massacre, more lives lost, the living pitted against the dead. And he, Sam Tarly, would be responsible. Before the standoff erupted, Sam raised both hands, trying to calm them all. His voice shook with desperation as he pleaded for a chance to explain, to show them that these undead could be an ally. Dickon stared in horror at the sight of half a dozen skeletons stepping forward at Sam's command. Some men shouted curses, crossing themselves, as though warding off evil. Sam felt the bond straining, the swirl of dread energy pulsing through him. He asked them to trust him just enough to see proof of the White Walker's threat, to let him lead this army north. If he failed, if it turned out to be an evil beyond redemption, then they could destroy him. Dickon looked unconvinced. His men were on the edge of panic. Marwyn hissed again for Sam to command the skeletons to attack or to move away. Sam's thoughts whirled. He realized that if he tried to push through, they would fight, and the men of House Tarly would be butchered. He could not stomach that. Yet if he surrendered, the undead would be forcibly destroyed or at least scattered, and the knowledge Sam had gained might be lost. The White Walkers would face far less resistance. He felt trapped. In the end, Sam made a choice. He turned to Marwyn and said, "No, we won't butcher my brother's men. I'll not see more innocent lives lost." Marwyn grew furious, saying that Sam was dooming them all, that the White Walkers would crush Westeros without this army. Sam's eyes filled with tears. He whispered, "We'll find another way. This is wrong." Dickon ordered his men to move in, intending to take Sam into custody. The skeletons stirred restlessly. Some advanced unbidden, responding to Sam's fear. The bond threatened to spiral out of control. Sam clutched his temples, fighting the mental chaos. He realized that letting these undead continue to exist was a gamble he could no longer justify. The risk was too great that they would slip free of his control or that they would simply cause more bloodshed. But the Archmaester was not so hesitant. Marwyn raised a hand, chanting a phrase Sam recognized from the Black Tome. Sam saw with horror that Marwyn had stolen a sample of Sam's blood from a ritual. He was using it to seize partial control of the Undead Legion, circumventing Sam. The Legion lurched as though torn between two masters. Sam cried out, telling Marwyn to stop. The men of House Tarly readied for battle, hearts pounding. A dreadful struggle of wills ensued. Sam tried to dismiss the army, to break the bond that animated them. Marwyn tried to solidify his hold, calling upon forbidden knowledge that crackled in the cold night air. The skeletons twitched, some raising old swords or spears, others standing inert. The men of Horn Hill shouted in confusion, expecting the worst. Dickon glared, uncertain whether to charge or flee. Sam mustered every ounce of mental and spiritual strength he had left. He recalled Gilly's tears, little Sam's tiny fingers clutching his own, and Jon Snow's unwavering bravery at the wall. He recalled the vow he had made to serve the Watch, to protect the realms of men. With tears streaming down his cheeks, he spoke the ultimate dismissal incantation, words that, if uttered incorrectly, might tear his soul or unleash a torrent of dark energy. But Sam found the clarity he needed, summoning the last vestiges of hope he possessed. The night air trembled. A sudden wind howled through the darkness, scattering leaves and dust. The skeletons jerked as though struck by lightning. Marwyn fought back, trying to maintain the bond, but Sam roared the incantation's final phrase, voice echoing with raw emotion. He felt the dark threads snapping, the necromantic cords he had woven disintegrating under the force of his will. Then, with a thunderous crack, the entire undead legion collapsed. Bones tumbled and clattered in a cacophony that rumbled across the field. A plume of dust enveloped them, and the air became thick with the stench of old death. When it cleared, the ground was littered with thousands of bones, lying still and inert. The men of Horn Hill stared in stunned silence. Dickon lowered his sword, uncertain of what he had just witnessed. Marwyn let out a cry of rage and frustration, calling Sam a fool, saying he had doomed them all. The Archmaester spat a final curse, then ran into the night before Dickon's men could apprehend him. Sam sank to his knees, panting, tears and sweat streaking his face. He had done it. He had destroyed the legion he had created. Relief mingled with heartbreak. All that effort, all that horror, undone in a single moment. The shame of what he had done weighed on him like millstones. Dickon cautiously approached, peering down at Sam. The swirl of questions in his eyes was clear. He did not know what to do with a brother who had just raised and then destroyed an army of the dead. In a halting voice, Sam tried once more to explain about the White Walkers, about how he had hoped to use the undead to fight them. He admitted the cost had been too high. The men of Horn Hill exchanged uneasy glances. Some wanted to put Sam in chains, others called for his execution. But Dickon, though shaking with anger and fear, recognized that Sam was no mere monster, but a broken man who had tried to protect the realm in a misguided way. In the end, Sam allowed Dickon to take him prisoner. They secured his hands, took the black tome from him, and carried him back to Horn Hill. In a dim tower chamber, Sam sat for days, drifting between delirium and exhausted silence. Dickon visited him, demanding answers about the White Walkers and the necromancy. Sam tried to recount everything calmly. At times, he raved about the presence in the darkness, the awful sense that it was not yet finished with him. At last, Dickon, uncertain how to handle such matters, placed Sam under guard and sent ravens to various lords, seeking counsel and aid. Though physically confined, Sam felt a strange sense of relief. The dreadful bond was gone, and with it, the constant weight of controlling an undead army. He hoped the damage could be undone, that maybe if the truth about the White Walkers spread, the living could unite in more conventional ways. Guilt gnawed at him. He thought of Gilly, wondered if she was safe, if she had heard rumors of his downfall. He cursed himself for his arrogance, for believing he could harness death for a righteous cause without becoming tainted by it. Days stretched into weeks. Eventually, a raven arrived bearing news of a major White Walker incursion in the north, of entire houses rallying to meet the threat. Word came, too, that Jon Snow was forging alliances, that Daenerys Targaryen had flown her dragons to Winterfell. Sam felt a twinge of hope. Perhaps they still had a chance. Let them face the others with living armies, with living men, rather than the monstrous legion Sam had almost unleashed. He remained in that tower chamber, guarded but not ill-treated. Outside the barred window, he saw the green fields of Horn Hill, the place he had once thought he would never see again. His father had cast him out, but the land was still beautiful. Despite everything, Sam felt more at peace than he had in many moons. Each night, he prayed that men would find victory without the abomination he had tried to create. Then, one day, Dickon came to his chamber, face drawn and somber. He told Sam that ravens spoke of a dire threat, that Winterfell was under siege by the dead. He had concluded that perhaps the time had come to use any means necessary. Sam's blood ran cold. He realized, with grim certainty, that some lords might not view necromancy as a crime if it could save them from the White Walkers. Dickon pressed him to raise the dead again, to try anew. Sam shuddered, recalling the moral abyss he had fallen into. This time, though, he suspected he would not be working in secret. Lords from across the Reach might sponsor him openly, forging entire armies from the grave. Sam wept, head bowed, haunted by nightmares of what he had done. He could not shake the memory of the presence that seemed to relish the raising of the dead. He feared that if he resumed the dark art, that presence would return, stronger than before. Yet men in desperate times do desperate things. Dickon stood waiting, uncertain but resolute in the face of the White Walker's approach. Sam, for his part, quivered inside. He thought of Gilly's face. He imagined the undead ripping through villages, unstoppable, or else the living being overrun by White Walkers. There were no easy answers, no safe paths. And thus Samwell Tarly found himself at a crossroads again, bound to a power he had barely comprehended, driven by a realm in need, balanced on the edge of damnation or deliverance. The road behind him was littered with regret and bones that would never rest truly at peace. The road ahead promised an even darker descent if he dared to walk it again. As he stared at the bars of his tower window, at the dying sunlight bathing the green hills of Horn Hill, he whispered a plea to the gods, old and new, for a chance at redemption, even if it meant walking through the blackest shadows once more. And in some distant, unseen corner of the world, that presence waited, stirred, and smiled with hollow anticipation, for it knew that men's hearts in times of terror could be turned to the darkness. And the darkness always welcomed those bold enough, or desperate enough, to raise an undead army in the name of hope. Samwell Tarly sat on the cold floor of the tower room in Horn Hill, staring at the thin line of light that seeped in through the narrow window. It was a faint promise of morning, an unsteady boundary between darkness and a world he once knew. Days had passed. He had lost count how many, since his brother Dickon had placed him under guard. The stone walls, hung with old banners of House Tarly, loomed around him like silent judges. Beneath his bent knees, the worn rushes gave off a faint musty smell, a reminder of simpler days when he had walked these halls as a frightened boy, uncertain of his worth. Now he returned with an unspeakable power tainting his conscience, a power he had wielded, then desperately tried to revoke. His jailer, a quiet man-at-arms named Calder, leaned against the far wall, still unsure how to treat this prisoner who was also the elder son of the late Lord Randall Tarly. Sam wondered if Calder had marched under his father's command in past wars, or perhaps had hunted with him in the golden fields of the Reach. The man seldom spoke, but his watchful eyes said enough. He had seen Sam conjure an army of bones, then reduce it back to dust. He had watched the ground spew up unholy forms at Sam's command. No wonder his expression held fear. Sam could not blame him. He closed his eyes, recalling everything that led him here. Old Town, the Citadel, the Black Tome, the crypt beneath the library, Marwyn and his urgings, a legion of skeletal warriors. The night the Hedge Knights stumbled upon them and one died horribly. That memory made Sam's throat tighten. And then, finally, the confrontation with Dickon's men, the clash of conflicting loyalties, and Sam's dismissal of the entire undead horde. The bones fell. Marwyn fled. Sam found himself kneeling in the dust of his own mistakes, surrounded by men sworn to House Tarly, who had no idea what to do with him. He had told himself that destroying the undead legion marked a sort of end, that he could breathe easier knowing he had not unleashed more horrors upon the realm. Yet the respite was short-lived. Word soon reached them that Winterfell was under siege. The White Walkers, or the others as the old stories named them, had come in greater force. Jon Snow, Sam's old friend and brother in the Night's Watch, was said to be leading a desperate defense, aided by wildlings, northern bannermen, and at least some support from Daenerys Targaryen and her dragons. But dragons alone might not be enough to halt the creeping tide of death. Sam remembered all too well how unstoppable the Whites seemed, how even a single White Walker could instill mortal terror in any living man. He had thought that by mastering necromancy he could level the field. Now that notion felt naive and twisted. Dickon Tarley visited him each morning, always wearing that same pained, uncertain expression. The first time, he demanded to know exactly how Sam had learned such foul magic, what deals with devils he had made. Sam tried to explain it was knowledge gleaned from old manuscripts in the Citadel, that he had never bargained with a demon nor worshipped some dark god. But the line between scholarship and sacrilege was blurred beyond recognition. Dickon listened, eyes shadowed by confusion, and then left in silence. The second time, Dickon returned with two men who looked more learned than typical soldiers. Men who had likely studied at the Citadel once, or acted as stewards to lords. They peppered Sam with questions. How exactly had he forced the bones to rise? Which incantations, which substances? How had he retained control? How large an army might be raised, and how quickly? They wanted the knowledge in cold, practical terms. Sam grew sick to his stomach, hearing their eagerness. These were not men recoiling from the black art. These were men who wanted to harness it. His explanations grew terse and stilted, and at length Dickon waved them away, disconcerted by Sam's reluctance. On the third day, Dickon came alone, slamming the tower room door behind him with frustration. He paced before Sam, chain mail clinking, his sword at his hip. "Samwell," he said, voice trembling, "I've had ravens from the north and from King's Landing. The realm is in chaos. They say the walkers have broken through the northern keeps. Dawn breaks, yet the nights grow longer, something unnatural. If these monsters are not stopped, everything will fall to ice and darkness. Can you truly look me in the eye and say your power is best left unused?" Sam's heart pounded. He wanted to say yes, that raising the dead was too terrible a price, that if men stooped to such dark means, they might lose their souls. But the memory of the White Walkers was seared into him. That merciless cold, the way whites tore men limb from limb, how in others' gaze froze the very blood. Could the living stand against that onslaught without every advantage at their disposal? He swallowed hard. Dickon cut him off, kneeling beside him so their eyes were level. "I know this is not you. You were the gentle brother, the one who hated violence, who fled rather than endure father's demands. And now you've somehow stumbled upon a power I do not understand. But the threat we face is beyond anything the living have known. The White Walkers do not parley, they do not halt. If what I hear is true, dragons alone might not suffice. The North is crying out for aid." Sam forced himself to speak. "I tried, Dickon. I raised an army, I saw what it did. I lost control. People died. If I do it again, how many more will die? How many might suffer at the hands of mindless corpses?" Dickon straightened, exhaling loudly. "All of us might die if the walkers triumph. It is no small decision. But the lords who are now consulting with me, with House Tarley, many of them are considering that if necromancy can match the White Walkers, it must be done. Some want to muster it, others fear it. There is no consensus. But if Winterfell falls, if the Stark boy, this Jon Snow, your friend, falls, then we're truly doomed. Word is the Vale is sending knights, the Stormlands raise banners. But who knows if it will be enough? The realm is fracturing, Sam. And in the midst of that fracture, the dead march." Sam looked at his own hands, the trembling fingers that once turned pages in the Citadel's library, searching for the key to saving the realm. He had never dreamt that key would be so dark. If he refused to help, he would remain here in Horn Hill as a prisoner, watching while the realm collapsed. If he cooperated, he risked unleashing nightmares. He closed his eyes, searching his own soul. In the darkness of his mind, he thought he felt a faint echo, a malignant presence that had once answered his call. It lurked at the edges of his thoughts, waiting for him to open the door again. At length, Sam said, "I will speak to the lords. I will explain the cost of this magic, the risk. If they still insist, and if it truly might save us, I will try. But it cannot be done lightly, nor blindly." Dickon nodded, relief warring with apprehension in his eyes. "They'll gather in the Great Hall tomorrow at midday. You'll be brought down under guard, of course, but you'll have your chance to speak. Please, Sam, do not hold back why. Oh, you know, I pray we can find a way to fight without damning ourselves." He left Sam alone in the tower. Calder, the jailer, resumed his silent vigil. Sam's mind spun like a mill wheel, weighed down by dread. He recalled the swirling magic, the incantations, the presence that felt so eager to claim him. Could he risk that again? Night fell over Horn Hill, the wind sighing through the courtyard. Sam tried to sleep, curling up on the floor, but rest eluded him. Even though he had no bone legion to command, his soul still bore the scars. Dreams assailed him, half-formed visions of the catacombs in Old Town, of Marwyn chanting, of half-rotted corpses clawing free of the earth. Sometimes he saw the face of the hedge knight who had died, twisted in agony, though Sam barely knew the man's name. He awoke with a shudder, tears burning his eyes. Dawn could not come soon enough. When morning arrived, Calder brought him a stiff piece of bread and watered wine. Sam's stomach churned. He had little appetite. He forced down a few bites to steady his trembling hands. An hour later, 2 additional guards arrived, House Tarley men with the huntsman's sigil on their surcoats. They unlocked the door, helped Sam stand. One removed the shackles from his wrists but kept them close at hand, in case Sam attempted some dark trick. Sam meekly followed. He had no desire to escape. Where would he run? North to Winterfell, hoping to face the White Walkers alone? Back to Gilly in Old Town, carrying the burden of half-finished necromancy? No, that would only put her in danger. They escorted him down narrow stone steps, passing corridors that he had not walked in years. Memories flitted by. His father shouting disapproval, his mother's gentle voice, servants hurrying along with baskets of fruit, and a young Dickon boasting about his hunting prowess. Sam felt like a ghost in a place that had once been his home. The halls grew wider as they approached the great hall, the sound of many voices rising in anxious murmurs. Torchlight flickered across the high-beamed ceiling, making shadows dance. Inside, lords and retainers clustered around a dais where Dickon stood, trying to maintain a semblance of composure. Most wore armor or half-armor, as if prepared for sudden conflict. Sam spotted sigils he recognized from the Reach: House Oakhart, House Rowan, House Fossaway, and a few lesser families. There were also men bearing no clear sigil, likely hedge knights or mercenaries drawn by the rumored threat from the north. A hush fell as Sam entered, flanked by guards. Eyes turned to him, some filled with outrage, others with naked fear. Whispers scurried through the crowd. The necromancer, the traitor's son, the man who defied death. Dickon raised a hand for silence. "My lords, as promised, I present Samwell Tarley, once of the Night's Watch, now returned to us in complicated circumstances." He shot a glance at Sam. "He claims the White Walkers are real, that they threaten all of Westeros. He has studied secret arts in the Citadel, and he has tested them." A ripple of unease swept the hall. Sam felt the weight of dozens of stares. Yet in that moment, a certain clarity settled over him. He recalled what it meant to be a brother of the Night's Watch, to speak truth no matter the cost. He straightened his shoulders, though his voice still wavered. "All of you have heard the rumors from the north. Some of you may doubt, but I swear on every vow I've ever taken, on the memory of my father." Sam paused, feeling the irony of invoking Randall Tarley's memory. "On everything I hold dear that the White Walkers are real. They command an army of whites, reanimated corpses that do not tire, do not fear, and cannot be reasoned with. I've seen them." He gestured to the nearest men. "Ask the Night's Watch. Ask any who have fought north of the Wall. They will tell you the truth." A lord with broad shoulders, Sam recalled him as Lord Rowan, leaned forward. "We do not doubt the threat, Maester Tarley, but rumor also says you command an army of dead yourself. Is this to be believed?" He spoke in a measured tone, trying to hide the tremor of dread. Several men muttered curses under their breath. One clutched at a pendant of the Seven, as if to ward off evil. Sam ran his tongue over dry lips. Was partially true. Through dark spells I uncovered in the Citadel, I raised a legion of skeletons. I believed that if the White Walkers commanded dead men, then we, the living, might need to do the same to stand any chance. But he faltered, memory surging. It was wrong. Even if used for a noble purpose, such power exacts a terrible cost. The dead do not always obey perfectly, and controlling them, it tears at the summoner's spirit. It draws the attention of forces we do not understand. Some of the younger knights traded worried glances. An older man with a hawkish nose said, "Yet you think we still may need it?" Dickon cleared his throat. "The realm is in dire peril. We have no illusions about that. The question is whether to use any means at our disposal or rely on more honorable strategies. The Lords of the Reach have come here to decide if Samwell Tarly's knowledge is to be harnessed or destroyed." The harshness of that final word rang in the hall. Sam's stomach knotted. He scanned the faces. Some looked eager for a weapon, any weapon, against the others. Others looked revolted by the idea of necromancy. At that moment, Sam fully realized the trap he was in. Either help them craft the darkest magic Westeros had seen since the days of old Valyria, or watch them decide he was too dangerous to live. He drew a shaking breath. "For those of you who push for necromancy," Sam began, "you must understand it is not a simple matter of chanting words and raising an army overnight. The ritual requires components. Some are rare, others dangerous to gather. It demands an enormous toll on the summoner. And controlling a large horde of the dead is unlike commanding soldiers. They lack minds, yes, but they respond to impulses, to fear, even to malice. If the summoner's will falters, if he grows exhausted or is struck down, the dead may act on their own. That can lead to horrors." Lord Rowan's expression tightened. "Could the White Walkers then assume control of the corpses you raise?" Sam closed his eyes momentarily. "It depends. If the Bond one establishes strong, the White Walkers might not be able to claim them. But that isn't proven. Marwyn, an archmaester who aided me, believed it would work, but we never tested it in a real battle against the others." The name Marwyn caused a flurry of murmurs. He was infamous enough at the Citadel, rumored to dabble in the higher mysteries. One older retainer spat. "So he's behind this foulness, then?" Sam answered softly. "He encouraged me, yes, but I must bear responsibility for my own actions. I made the choice to attempt these spells. Marwyn has since fled. I do not know where he's gone." Dickon nodded to the crowd. "We have some measure of the danger. What we need is to decide how to proceed. Are we truly so desperate as to attempt raising an army of our own dead and marching it north?" A knight wearing House Hightower's sigil, a tower crowned with flames, spoke up in a hoarse whisper. "We have had ravens from the Citadel. They say the White Walkers' approach is swift, that the lines at Moat Cailin have collapsed. The Vale's knights are pinned near the eastern roads. King's Landing is in disarray. Cersei Lannister is gone, some say dead, and chaos grips the city. Many High Lords are uncertain if the Targaryen Queen is truly committed to defending the realm or just bent on claiming the Iron Throne." He paused, swallowing. "The point is, my lords, we cannot rely solely on others to save us. The Citadel's own stance is that they are uncertain. The dragons can only be in one place at a time. If Winterfell falls, all will be lost." A hush followed. Sam wondered how quickly the others were truly advancing, whether the nights in the north had grown impossibly cold. He recalled the crisp terror of seeing a White Walker for the first time in the forest, how he had nearly died from fear alone. If that was multiplied across the entire realm, if men cowered behind locked doors while the dead battered them down, Dickon's stern voice cut through the silence. "We have no more time for dithering. I am calling a vote among the lords present. Those who stand by House Tarly's banner, weigh your choice. If the majority commands it, Samwell will be compelled to raise the dead in our service and lead them north to face the White Walkers. If the majority refuses, then Samwell's knowledge remains locked away. But be warned, if we reject it and winter devours us all, we shall have no second chance." Lord Rowan, House Oakhart, House Hightower, and the others exchanged tense whispers. Sam felt his heart pounding. He suddenly realized that even if they chose to force him, he might lack the strength to do it on the scale required. But what if they threatened Gilly, threatened everyone he cared about to make him comply? A cold sweat broke across his brow. One by one, representatives gave their stance. House Oakhart's lady demanded they not dabble in black sorcery, citing the faith of the Seven's condemnation of such arts. House Rowan said they could not ignore any possible weapon against the others, that their entire line might perish in the next year if they stood idle. House Fossaway was divided. Two cousins represented the main branch, one supporting necromancy, the other condemning it. Heated words were exchanged. Threats were uttered. A lesser knight from the region near Bandolin stepped forward, voice trembling as he recounted hearing about the massacre of Hardhome, where thousands died and rose again under the White Walker's sway. He insisted that unless they matched that power, the living were doomed. Another insisted that meddling with necromancy would only hasten the realm's downfall. In the end, the debate ran in circles until Dickon demanded a simple call of voices. Sam was stunned to hear more lords in favor than against. Fear drove them. Terrible as necromancy might be, the dread of an unstoppable undead legion from the north outweighed moral qualms. A narrow majority emerged. Dickon, swallowing his own revulsion, declared, "Then it is decided. The great council of the Reach, such as it is in these broken times, calls upon Samwell Tarly to raise an army of the dead to protect us from the White Walkers." The minority of lords still opposed scowled and muttered about abominations, but they were not strong enough to override the decision. Dickon looked at Sam, who felt the eyes of the entire hall upon him. His knees felt weak. For a moment, he wondered if this was how the world ended. Men, desperate to save themselves, forging an even darker path. Dickon spoke quietly. "Samwell, do you have it in you to do this again?" Sam swallowed, tasting bile. I will try, but you must understand the constraints. I cannot simply wave a hand and conjure thousands of corpses. I need a place suitable for ritual, preferably a cavern or catacomb, where the wards can be contained. We need bodies, many bodies. They should be old enough that they won't be as fleshy. The fresher the corpse, the more difficult it is to control. But if it's all skeleton, then it has less strength. There is a middle ground, but that risks a monstrous sight, even more monstrous. Some lords cringed at the image. Dickon's face was grim, but he nodded. "We will find a place. The Tarly crypts are large, older than any living memory, but we do not have thousands of bodies there. Only my father's line going back generations. We will need more." A wave of unease swept the hall. Sam felt dizzy. They were speaking of collecting the dead like cattle. Where would they find them? The idea was grotesque, yet it was exactly what Sam had done in Old Town, though on a smaller scale. He forced his voice to be steady. "It must be done discreetly. If word spreads that we are raising the dead across the Reach, we risk panic and revolt. And any infiltration by saboteurs, or the White Walkers themselves, could corrupt the ritual. We must be cautious." "Agreed," said Dickon. Then he turned to the hall. "I will dispatch men to gather suitable remains from old graveyards, battlefields, crypts. We cannot rely on too many fresh corpses. Morale would crumble if we desecrate family tombs of the living. We will do what we must, but we will do it carefully." At that, the formal meeting broke into smaller groups of hushed conversation. Sam was exhausted, but a new tension gnawed at him. He had just been commanded to re-enter the darkness he had tried so desperately to escape. Before he could speak further, Dickon gestured for the guards to escort Sam out of the hall and to a slightly more comfortable chamber. A sign of grudging respect or necessity, Sam was not sure. "You'll remain under watch until we begin the preparations," Dickon said. "I cannot have you vanish, nor do I want you harmed. Rest for now, Samwell. We'll need your mind sharp soon." Sam offered no protest, letting himself be led away. The guards took him to a small room on the same floor as the Lord's chambers, with a bed, a small table, and a single window overlooking the courtyard. The door had a heavy iron lock. Calder and another guard posted themselves outside, leaving Sam alone within. He sank onto the bed, burying his face in his hands. A dull ache throbbed in his temples. He was trapped in a nightmare of his own making. The realm needed saving, but the method was vile. Was there truly no other way? The day passed slowly. Through the window, Sam glimpsed riders departing the castle, no doubt to fulfill Dickon's orders. Some might go to the Tarley Seat's lesser villages, searching for old crypts or mass graves from ancient wars. Others might ride to gather special reagents Sam had listed: weirwood bark, dragonglass powder, certain herbs known to amplify magical resonances. Sam loathed to recite these instructions, but he had done so under duress. The lords wanted results, and they wanted them soon. Night fell again. Sam remained sleepless, pacing the confines of his small room. Sometimes he thought of Gilly, wondered how she fared in Old Town. A pang of longing for her and little Sam nearly overwhelmed him. Did she think him dead or lost? Had she guessed the terrible path he was on? He yearned to see her again, to explain, to beg her forgiveness. But that might never happen. His musings were interrupted by a knock at the door. Calder peered in, carrying a lantern. "My lord brother is here," he said softly, meaning Dickon. Sam stiffened. Moments later, Dickon stepped into the room, face etched with tension. Calder retreated, shutting the door for privacy. Dickon studied Sam, shoulders heavy with the burdens of leadership he had never expected to bear. "My men have begun the search. We found an old series of caves not far from the southern border of our lands. They're rumored to connect to caverns that run beneath the hills for miles. My father once said they were used in ancient times for smuggling or worship of the old gods. We'll clear them out, set wards. You'll be taken there as soon as possible." Sam nodded weakly. "I'll do what I can, but I must emphasize, controlling a mass of undead is not a simple matter. I almost lost command of them before. If something goes wrong..." Dickon held up a hand. "I know the risks, but a choice must be made. Countless ravens have arrived with bleak news. The north is on the verge of collapse. If Winterfell falls, the others will sweep south. The lords who came to Horn Hill have pledged men to defend us, but they're too few. My only hope is that a necromantic force will turn the tide, or at least slow it enough for reinforcements to arrive." Sam heard the desperate undertone in Dickon's voice. They were both trapped by fate. With a sigh, Sam asked, "Will the faith not condemn us? Will they not declare us heretics?" Dickon's gaze flickered. "Some septons have already labeled it an abomination, but fear has a way of silencing moral voices. The High Septon is rumored to be sheltering in the Great September, terrified, praying for deliverance. King's Landing is fractured. If the White Walkers reach the capital, no one will be safe. We Tarleys have to do what we must for the Reach." Sam rubbed his temples. He remembered that the Tarley name once stood for martial valor and discipline, not dark sorcery. Yet here they were. "We must ensure absolute secrecy," he said. "If the White Walker spies, if they have any learn what we're doing, they may strike first. Also, we cannot gather too many fresh corpses. It's a slippery slope. The older the remains, the less moral outrage will stir. People will still fear us, but at least we're not snatching the newly dead from their graves." Dickon grimaced at the horrifying practicality of it. "Agreed. We'll do what we can." After he left, Sam slumped onto the bed again, numb with exhaustion. It was as if a boulder rolled over him. Every path led to darkness. He tried to recall if there was any rumor of other weapons that might repel the others. Dragonfire could destroy whites, but only if a dragon was present. Dragonglass and Valyrian steel could kill White Walkers themselves, but forging an entire army armed with Valyrian steel was impossible. And the supply of dragonglass, though larger than it once was, might not suffice for the entire realm. Blood magic, necromancy, these were last resorts. He wondered if the children of the forest had secrets beyond mortal ken, or if Bran Stark, rumored to be a green seer, might have found a better solution. But Sam was stuck in Horn Hill, forced to do the unthinkable. Days turned to weeks as preparations advanced. Riders came and went at all hours. Wagons arrived under cover of night, bearing crates that smelled of decay. Sam dreaded even thinking about their contents, but he knew each was filled with the remains of men and beasts exhumed from ancient burial sites. The Tarly men scoured old battlefields where skeletons lay deep in the soil, dating back to the times of the Durandan kings or older. The area around the ruins of Summerhall yielded more remains, some so charred and ancient that Sam doubted they would be of any use. But the lords were thorough. At last, the day came when Dickon ordered Sam to the caves. A cloaked escort accompanied them, riding through the rolling hills under a slate-gray sky. A cold wind rattled the sparse autumn leaves. Sam wondered if the cold came from an early winter or from the creeping doom in the north. Either way, it felt ominous. He rode a docile mare, hands unbound but carefully watched. Dickon rode beside him, silent, as if unable to find any words that could justify or comfort. They reached a rocky outcrop where a ragged mouth in the hillside opened onto a dark tunnel. Guards with torches and crossbows stood sentry. The damp smell of earth and mildew wafted out. Inside, crates of bones lay stacked, along with sacks of reagents, barrels of water, and other supplies. A handful of men busied themselves setting up braziers and rudimentary wards drawn from chalk and pig's blood. Sam nearly gagged at the sight, recalling too vividly his experiments with Marwyn in Old Town. Dickon dismounted, handing the reins to a squire. He gestured for Sam to follow. Together, they descended into the cavern. Torches on the walls cast flickering shadows across the stone. After a short walk, the passage opened into a broader chamber, its ceiling lost in darkness. Stalactites dripped water, forming tiny puddles that reflected the torchlight. The crates of remains had been arranged in a circle around a cleared A of gravel. This would be the ritual space. Many of the lords are mustering their men in a camp not far from here, Dickon explained in a low voice. When the time is right, we'll march north. We want your army, these reanimated remains, to stay hidden in these caves until we're ready to move. If we can avoid detection, it might give us an advantage. Sam's mouth felt dry. You ask me to raise them here, then keep them docile for weeks, perhaps? Do you have any idea how difficult that will be? The power required is immense, especially if you want a large force. Dickon's face hardened with worry. If the White Walkers break through the neck, we won't have weeks. They could be at the Trident in a fortnight, the Stormlands soon after, and the Reach might be next. We need the undead horde ready to march as soon as possible. He placed a hand on Sam's shoulder, a gesture that felt both brotherly and desperate. I know this is more than anyone should bear, but we have no choice. Sam swallowed, the reality pressing in on him. The men had already begun to lay out lines of chalk, forming a ritual circle. He told them how to place small braziers at the 4 cardinal points, how to sprinkle certain powders in measured arcs. The memory of the Black Tome's instructions haunted him. He had tried to commit them to memory after reading them so many times, but some details remained fuzzy. Marwyn had guided him before. Now he alone had to instruct these men who had no deep understanding of magic. They simply did as told, trusting Sam's knowledge. It took hours to arrange everything to Sam's specifications. He insisted on breaks, walking the perimeter of the chamber, feeling for the natural flows of energy. The men didn't understand and likely thought him mad, but they complied. Dickon hovered nearby, arms folded, impatience etched in his features. Torchlight glinted off the steel of his breastplate, off the damp walls. Water dripped incessantly. The crates of bones stood, ominous sentinels of what was to come. Finally, Sam declared the ritual space ready. They had placed the remains in neat piles around the circle's edges. He asked for certain items: a portion of weirwood bark, a small block of dragonglass carefully ground into powder, and a bowl of fresh goat's blood. Dickon blanched at the last request, but Sam explained it was necessary to anchor the incantation. The men fetched a goat from a pen outside the cave, sacrificed it with as little cruelty as possible, and brought Sam a wooden bowl brimming with steaming blood. Sam set it at the circle's center, feeling ill. "Clear the chamber," he ordered, voice low. "All but a few watchers must leave. If too many men are here, the energies might get confused, or the presence might latch onto someone else. I can't risk that." A presence, that was how he described it, though he suspected it was far more than a mere presence. He felt it nibbling at the corner of his awareness, as if anticipating a feast. Dickon selected 2 guards to remain, along with himself and 1 lesser lord who had proven adept at drawing the wards. The rest withdrew to the passage, though many lingered at the entrance, uncertain. Sam strode to the center of the circle, mindful not to smudge the chalk lines, and knelt by the bowl of blood. He laid out a piece of parchment on which he had transcribed the incantation, an incomplete copy of the Black Tome's original text. He swallowed hard. The final lines, the darkest phrases, had never felt more ominous. He drew a small dagger, pricked his thumb. Blood welled, dripping into the goat's blood. He heard Dickon's soft intake of breath as Sam began to chant. The words reverberated in the cavern, ancient syllables that felt like shards of ice scraping across Sam's mind. The braziers flickered, the shadows lengthened. The circle of chalk glowed faintly in the torchlight, as though responding to the incantation. Each word sent a tremor through Sam's body. He struggled to keep his voice steady, to keep his heart from seizing with fear. His senses sharpened. He felt the piles of bones around him, a latent potential. He also felt that entity in the darkness, a dreadful sense that something listened, something older than the faith of the 7, older than the old gods, even. His vision blurred at the edges. The dripping stalactites seemed to echo tenfold in his ears. He pressed on, chanting, weaving the magic that would bind the remains to his will. As he neared the final lines, he felt an invisible presence press down on him, as if a giant hand tried to force him to the ground. He half expected to see Marwyn lurking in the shadows, or the White Walkers themselves. Pain flared in his temples, but he pushed through. The incantation reached a crescendo, and he poured the last of his breath into the final phrase, releasing the power he had gathered. Silence. For one terrible instant, Sam thought he had failed. Then the air grew cold. A wind circled through the cavern despite there being no obvious source, blowing out one of the torches. Dust swirled. Dickon and the 2 guards exchanged alarmed looks, hands drifting to their weapons. The lesser lord muttered a prayer. A rasping sound broke the hush, the scrape of bone against stone. Sam's eyes darted to one of the crates. A skeletal hand emerged, gripping the crate's rim. Another crate trembled, as if something inside sought escape. Soon, a cacophony of rattles and clacks filled the chamber. Bones, drawn by the spell's compulsion, tumbled forth from their piles, colliding and connecting in unnatural assembly. Ribs slid into place against spines. Skulls clacked onto vertebrae. Some skeletons lacked pieces, so they jerked and twisted, half-formed. Others found scraps of rotted cloth or rusted armor. The guards gasped as the newly formed skeletons staggered upright, at least 2 dozen in the immediate circle, with more still emerging. Their eye sockets were empty, but some glowed faintly with an eerie bluish or greenish sheen, a reflection of the strange energies swirling in the air. Sam felt 100 invisible threads in his mind, each skeleton tethered to him. He had to hold them, will them to remain still. The effort drained him, like trying to hold an ocean wave with bare hands. Dickon, face pale, took a cautious step forward. Sam, can you control them? Sam's throat felt raw. He concentrated, sending a silent command for the skeletons to stand in formation. They responded slowly, arms hanging loosely, some limping, but they lined up in a rough row, like soldiers awaiting orders. The presence in Sam's mind swelled, urging him to push further, to raise more. Hundreds of crates remained. The slightest slip of his will, and the skeletons might go berserk, turning on them. He clenched his fists, sweat beading his forehead. Yes, he said hoarsely. For now. Dickon exhaled, relief mixing with horror in his expression. The lesser lord stared, half fascinated, half terrified. The 2 guards exchanged a look of astonishment. One had tears in his eyes, as if uncertain whether to hail Sam as a savior or condemn him as a demon. Sam felt no triumph, only dread. He had entered the labyrinth once more. They began a slow, methodical process of raising more skeletons. Sam took breaks between incantations to recover, sipping water, sometimes nearly vomiting from the strain. In a mere day, the cavern filled with row upon row of bony figures, each bound to Sam's will by necromantic cords that pulsed in his mind. He learned to anchor them to small runic stones inscribed with fragments of the incantation, which lessened his immediate burden. But it still required his overarching control. He taught a handful of chosen men how to maintain the wards in case he collapsed. None of them understood the deeper mysteries, but they could keep the skeletons from running amok for a short time. Dickon watched, troubled, as the undead ranks swelled. The total number was uncertain, for some skeletons lacked limbs, others were incomplete, but they counted well over 300 in the main chamber alone. Another side passage housed 200 more, and more crates awaited unpacking. Each day, the watchers had to carry more torchlight deeper into the caves to find space. The air reeked of decay, though most of the remains were skeletal. Sam's nights were plagued by nightmares so vivid he sometimes woke screaming. He found no solace in prayers. His faith in the Seven or the old gods had never been especially strong. He had always placed more faith in books. Now even that was tainted. He soldiered on, telling himself that if this unholy legion turned the tide against the White Walkers, it would be worth it. Yet he remembered the fate of that hedge night, recalled how swiftly the skeletons had ripped him apart. One misstep, and they might do the same to countless innocents. Between incantations, Sam gleaned news from the outside. Ravens arrived daily. The White Walkers had indeed shattered the lines at Moat Cailin, pushing into the territory near the Twins. The Vale's knights fought valiantly, but the others spread out, sending white hordes in multiple directions. Winterfell, rumored to be Daenerys Targaryen's stronghold alongside Jon Snow, still held for now. The last Raven said the combined armies of the North and several southern allies had engaged a massive white force near the last river. The outcome remained uncertain. Lord Rowan himself visited the caves one evening, having ridden from the mustering camp. He was both horrified and impressed by the sight of hundreds of skeletons standing motionless in the torchlight. He asked Sam pointedly if more could be raised quickly, if needed. Sam forced himself to reply that while it was possible, each new wave drained him further. The simplest approach was to animate everything in stages, building a force that could be reactivated once they marched. Rowan nodded, uneasy. Clearly, the lords wanted a large number, perhaps thousands. Sam did not know if he could manage that many. At the Citadel, records existed of certain necromancers in the distant east who commanded legions of tens of thousands, but the cost was rumored to be entire kingdoms sacrificed in blood rituals. Sam prayed they would not go that far. On the 7th day of raising skeletons, Sam reached his limit. He collapsed in a faint after completing the final incantation for a batch of 24. Dickon and the Watchers rushed to help him, forcing water between his lips. His vision swam. The presence in his mind felt dangerously strong. He muttered deliriously about shadows in the corner of the cave. Someone carried him out to the surface, where the crisp air revived him slightly. He lay on a bedroll near the cave's mouth, trembling uncontrollably. Dickon knelt beside him, face lined with worry. "Brother, you need rest," he murmured. "Enough for now." Sam nodded weakly. He could hardly lift his head. "How many have we raised?" Dickon glanced over his shoulder at the torchlit entrance. "Close to 600. That is more than the garrison of a mid-sized castle. And we still have more remains if we choose to continue. But you cannot kill yourself in the process. Rest, Samwell. I'll post watchers to ensure the undead remain docile." Sam closed his eyes, letting exhaustion drag him under. In his dreams, the skeletons towered over him, bones morphing into monstrous shapes. He heard the voice of the White Walkers, shrill as cracking ice, whispering that he belonged to them now, that his necromancy was merely another facet of death's dominion. He dreamt of Marwyn, cackling in the darkness, holding a shard of Sam's soul in his hand. When Sam awoke, the dream clung to him like cold sweat. Days blurred together. Sam's health improved marginally as they paused the necromantic rites. His appetite returned somewhat, though each meager meal tasted like sawdust. He insisted on walking through the cavern daily, checking that the skeletons remained inert. The watchers had hammered small runic stones into the cave walls, each inscribed with partial wards. Sam shored them up with dribbles of goat's blood and murmured incantations. The skeletons remained in place, a silent army awaiting orders. Some held rusted swords or spears scavenged from old stockpiles, giving them an even more macabre appearance. Outside, the living army of the Reach gathered. Lord Rowan brought 1,000 men, House Oakhart nearly as many, Hightower a contingent of knights, while Dickon Tarley commanded the Tarley forces. Lesser houses and hedge knights arrived, forming a ragtag host that would normally be dwarfed by a royal army in peacetime. But in these chaotic days, it seemed formidable enough to at least put up a fight. They encamped in a broad valley about 2 miles from the caves, out of direct sight. The question loomed: when to march north? Raven after raven arrived with grim tidings. The others were on the move, no longer content to lay siege to Winterfell. They spread across the land, unstoppable. The king in the north, Jon Snow, was rumored to be requesting urgent help. Daenerys Targaryen still commanded dragons, but one was rumored lost, turned into an ice dragon by the White Walkers, if the tales were to be believed. The realm teetered on the brink of devastation. After much debate, the lords of the Reach decided they could delay no longer. They resolved to head north within a fortnight, to meet whatever remained of the living forces. Winter pressed from the south as well. Cold winds battered the camps, killing crops and causing supplies to dwindle. Another impetus to move. Dickon returned to the caves one evening, accompanied by the same lesser lord who acted as a liaison. They found Sam near a brazier, rechecking runic stones. Dickon's face was set with determination. "We march in 10 days, Samwell. We'll pass through the Rose Road, gather allies where we can. The lords want your undead legion with us. We must show unity, strength. The sight of it might also rally or terrify men. Who can say?" Sam's eyes flicked over the motionless skeletons. "You want me to have them walk in the open? That alone may cause panic wherever we go." Dickon grimaced. "We'll have them march at night on separate roads if needed, with illusions or cloaks. There are ways. But eventually we must reveal them. The White Walkers themselves are far more terrifying, or so we hope." Sam knew illusions could only do so much, and the chance of rumors spreading was high. But it seemed there was no alternative. He bowed his head. "As you command." For the next week, frantic preparations took place. Smiths in the camp tried to fashion some crude weapons for the skeletons, if only sharpened pikes or rusted swords. The Watchers practiced simple commands, so Sam would not be solely responsible for every movement. However, the Watchers could only do so much. Without Sam's presence, the Legion was prone to drifting into eerie stillness or sudden chaos. He was the linchpin. The men whispered that if Sam died, the skeletons might rampage. Yet they also feared that if Sam lived and the Legion turned on them, they would face a disaster from within. Tension simmered in every corner of the camp. Dickon worked tirelessly to maintain order. He seemed to rely on Sam's guidance for dealing with the undead, but also tried not to appear subservient in front of the other lords. They still viewed Sam with distrust, some with outright loathing, but they had committed themselves to this path. "No turning back," Dickon said often, as if trying to convince himself as much as the men. On the night before they departed, Sam stood at the cave entrance, gazing at a sky devoid of stars. Clouds scudded overhead, threatening a cold rain or snow. He felt something shift in the air, a subtle current. Perhaps the others had moved again, or perhaps it was just the changing season. He rubbed the scar on his palm where he had pricked himself countless times for blood magic. It had never fully healed, and occasionally burned with a dull ache. He recalled a memory from Castle Black, of simpler times sharing meager meals with John, PYP, and Gren, laughing in the bitter cold. He had been a coward, yet he had never imagined he would become this, a necromancer forging an army of corpses. The vow of the Night's Watch said to hold no lands, take no wife, father no children. Sam had broken or bent many of those strictures, but he still clung to the vow's deeper meaning, to guard the realms of men. Was this monstrous act a form of guardianship, or a betrayal of everything the watch stood for. Morning dawned gray and cheerless. The living army mustered on the hillside. Tents struck, wagons loaded, horses saddled. Lords shouted orders, foot soldiers readied. Sam, with trembling resolve, began the process of rousing the undead legion from their static vigil. The watchers and he chanted in unison, performing a series of smaller incantations that reactivated the wards. The skeletons jerked to life by the hundreds, forming up in rough ranks. Dickon arrived on horseback, flanked by knights. He watched with tight-lipped awe as the cave vomited forth an army of bone, marching two abreast out into the overcast daylight. Several living soldiers shrank back, crossing themselves or whispering prayers. The skeletons moved with an awkward, rattling gait, some lacking full sets of ribs, others dragging mismatched feet. Yet they held weapons, or at least clubs, and they marched in unison under Sam's silent direction. The host departed. True to Dickon's word, the skeletons stayed in a column separate from the main body, marching at a distance. Sam rode at the head of the undead, which caused him to feel exposed and uneasy. If any living soldiers grew panicked, they might turn their spears on him or the skeletons. But so far, fear kept them in line. Word spread that these bone warriors were the realm's best hope against the White Walkers, that they were not to be antagonized. The column advanced slowly. Each day brought them further north along the Rose Road. The nights were sleepless for Sam, as he labored to keep the legion docile. He realized he could let them stand inert at night, which eased his burden somewhat, but watchmen posted around the undead still jumped at every rattle of bone or shift of wind. Inevitably, travelers or peasants from nearby villages spotted the bizarre sight of an army flanking a column of the undead. Rumors flew ahead of them. Some declared that a great necromancer marched at the bidding of King John. Others proclaimed the arrival of a monstrous plague. Dickon and the lords did their best to calm the countryside, distributing small amounts of grain or coin to those displaced by the White Walker threat. Still, Sam saw the fear in people's eyes as they glimpsed the skeletons. He no longer blamed them. Who could see such an abomination and not recoil? Their progress was slow, hampered by the constant threat of early snows and the logistical nightmare of feeding thousands of living soldiers. The undead did not need food, water, or rest, but they required Sam's presence. Some nights, the bitter cold seeped into his very bones, and he wondered if he was becoming one of them, an empty husk moved by dark magic. Occasionally, he overheard living soldiers mutter that Sam Tarley's eyes had changed, that he no longer seemed fully human. He tried to ignore such talk, but it gnawed at him. One freezing dusk found them near the northern boundary of the Reach, approaching lands that once belonged to House Oscry. A ragged messenger arrived at a gallop, nearly collapsing off his horse. Lord Rowan took him aside, then rushed to Dickon's tent, beckoning Sam to join them. Inside, the messenger gasped out news that the White Walkers had apparently overwhelmed the Riverlands. Harrenhal was said to be a haunted ruin, though it always was rumored to be cursed. The undead tide was unstoppable. The messenger also claimed that a massive white host was marching south from the Neck, while another angled west toward the Vale. Winterfell was still besieged, with Daenerys Targaryen and Jon Snow trapped. Communication was sporadic. Some said a dragon had been slain by an other wielding an icy spear. Others claimed the dragons still fought fiercely. Dickon and Lord Rowan looked grim. The question hung in the air. Should they attempt to bypass the main roads to head straight for Winterfell, or try to unite with any other southern armies? The Targaryen queen had called all able-bodied men to rally in the north. But that might be suicide if the others controlled the territory between. Dickon turned to Sam, who stood shivering in the tent. If Winterfell falls, all is lost. I see no point in trying to defend the south if the White Walkers can simply keep pushing. We must join the fight there, Dickon said. Lord Rowan nodded in hesitant agreement. But the journey to Winterfell across war-torn lands might be impossible. Sam took a deep breath. Perhaps, if we move swiftly, avoid major roads. The undead do not tire. They can keep marching day and night. Our living soldiers, though, need rest. He rubbed his brow. He was speaking as if they planned to outflank a mortal enemy, but the White Walker's whites needed no rest either. We must be prepared for the possibility of encountering an enemy White Legion. If that happens, we put our undead against theirs. Could be catastrophic. I don't know how they'll interact. Dickon's hands curled into fists. Then so be it. We cannot sit idle. We push on. Let the bones clash with bones. At least it might buy the living time. The decision was made. They angled their march northeast, forging a path toward the distant north. Winter grew harsher each day, snow sometimes blanketing the roads, forcing the living to slow. But Sam's undead trudged onward relentlessly, silent except for the rhythmic clack of their joints. Whenever they passed through deserted hamlets, the men saw signs of suffering, frozen bodies of peasants who had fled or died. Occasionally, Sam wondered if they should gather these fresher corpses to add to the legion, but he could not stomach the moral cost. Nor did they have time to perform elaborate rituals each day. They pressed on, sleepless, haunted. Somewhere in the hills east of the God's Eye, they encountered their first real opposition, bandits who had formed a small rogue army, preying on refugees. The bandits attacked, hoping to catch the living soldiers off guard. They had not accounted for the undead. At Sam's silent command, the skeletons pivoted in perfect unison and fell upon the brigands. Spears of old bone and rusted blades sliced into them. The bandits, seeing their foes were not alive, panicked. They tried to retreat but were quickly overwhelmed. Within minutes, nearly all lay dead or dying. Some living soldiers cheered. Others stared in horror as the skeletons continued to hack at fallen foes until Sam shouted for them to stop. Blood soaked the snow. Sam felt sick. He had wanted to save the realm from the White Walkers, not butchermen. Yet here he was, commanding an army with no mercy. They buried the bandit corpses in a shallow pit, or as many as they could. Some of the watchers suggested raising them, but Sam refused. Enough horror. The living soldiers who had cheered soon fell silent, uneasy with the devastation the skeletons could inflict. And that was just a small skirmish. As they forged further north, the signs of winter's stranglehold multiplied. Rivers froze over. Crops lay withered. Entire villages abandoned. They occasionally encountered columns of refugees heading south, pale and half-starved. The sight of the skeletons terrified them. Many turned and fled into the wilderness, despite attempts by Rowan's men to offer help. It was a stark reminder that Sam's army, though intended to fight for the living, was an abomination in the eyes of all who beheld it. At last, after weeks of grueling travel, they crossed into the Riverlands proper, a realm turned grim by both war and winter. Smoke rose from charred villages. Unburied corpses dotted the roads, some already reanimated by the White Walkers, forcing Sam's men to fight them off. Those whites, mindless and driven only by the others' will, attacked with ferocity. But Sam's skeletons met them in savage battles, bone on rotting flesh, hacking and tearing. On more than one occasion, the Watchers reported that the whites tried to seize control of Sam's skeletons, but it seemed that the necromantic wards he had established held firm. Sam only glimpsed these skirmishes from afar at times, sickened by the horror, but he pressed on. The living soldiers suffered casualties: frostbite, exhaustion, ambushes by pockets of whites that emerged at night. Lord Oakhart perished when a White Walker itself rode into their camp at dawn, slicing through men with an ice blade. Sam's undead legion eventually forced it to retreat, but not without heavy losses. Sam found that reassembling destroyed skeletons took time and effort, so each victory cost him as well. Even the Watchers began to crack under the strain, leaving Sam with fewer men to help maintain the wards. Dickon soldiered on, commanding the living with stoic resolve. He rarely showed fear in front of the men, but Sam knew the weight pressed on him too. Near the ruins of Harrenhal, they encountered a larger White Walker force, including what appeared to be thousands of whites. A pitched battle loomed. The lords conferred, deciding whether to attempt to flank or to go around. But it was too late. The White Walkers had spotted them. As dusk settled, the living scrambled to form lines on a broad plain while Sam positioned his undead legion at the forefront. A hush fell across the field, broken only by the mournful wind. Snow flurries danced in the dying light. Then the white horde advanced, a writhing mass of rotted flesh and bone, arms outstretched, eyes glowing with cold fire. Sam's skeletons, arrayed in something resembling a shield wall, awaited the command. He stood behind them, breath fogging in the icy air. Dickon, on horseback, raised his sword. In the distance, silhouettes of White Walkers loomed, slender and inhuman, controlling their undead with malevolent ease. Sam uttered a silent prayer to any god who might listen. Then he mentally commanded his skeletons to charge. It was like unleashing a dam of horrors. The two abominations collided in the field, the whites shrieking, the skeletons silent but relentless. Swords hacked through decaying limbs, spears rattled against bones. The Watchers tried to keep the wards intact, but Sam bore most of the burden. Waves of mental fatigue washed over him as he struggled to keep each skeleton from losing cohesion. Meanwhile, from behind, the living archers loosed arrows into the whites, some flaming, some tipped with dragonglass. The White Walkers themselves strode through the chaos, striking down undead or living with frost-laden blades. Sam's eyes fixed on one of them, tall and gaunt, hair like fine ice, eyes glowing a piercing blue. He felt its gaze searching, testing his control over the skeletons. Then it happened. The White Walker lifted a hand in a gesture Sam recognized, an attempt to wrest control. Sam felt a savage pull in the bond linking him to the skeletons, as if a black hole of cold was trying to suck them away. He clenched his jaw, pouring his will into resisting. For a few terrifying heartbeats, the skeletons twitched, uncertain. Some turned on each other, hacking blindly. Others continued fighting the whites. Sam's entire body shook with effort. He screamed, voice lost in the din of battle, summoning every scrap of necromantic power he had. The wards glowed a sickly green, fighting the White Walker's intrusion. Slowly, Sam felt the presence recede, rebuffed. His skeletons rallied, continuing their assault on the whites. Dickon led the cavalry around one flank, clashing with smaller packs of undead. Snow whipped across the battlefield. Blood, black ichor, and shattered bone littered the ground. The Watchers themselves joined the fray, brandishing torches soaked in flammable resin. Sam retreated behind the lines of skeletons, barely able to stand. He knew that if he collapsed, the skeletons might revert to mere bone or worse, fall under the White Walker's influence. The White Walkers, perhaps taken aback by the resistance, unleashed a fresh wave of whites from the rear. The field churned with chaos. Sam's skeletons fought savagely but lacked the raw physical strength of fresh corpses. The whites battered them, ripping bones apart. On the other hand, the skeletons did not bleed or feel pain. In that swirling maelstrom, Sam saw glimpses of living men locked in mortal combat, saw Dickon's banner whipping in the wind. Then he noticed a White Walker pushing deep into the ranks of the skeletons, headed straight for him. Ice crackled in the air. Sam tried to direct a group of skeletons to intercept, but the White Walker cut them down with effortless strokes, shattering bones that turned to powder at the chill of its blade. Sam's heart thumped wildly. He remembered the single time he had killed a White Walker with dragonglass beyond the wall, how it had shattered like fragile glass. But he had no dragonglass dagger in hand now. He had only the necromantic control. The White Walker advanced, eyes locked on Sam. Fear seized him. He scrambled backward, his boots slipping in mud and half-frozen slush. With a frantic thought, Sam commanded a half-dozen skeletons to converge. They rushed the White Walker, skeleton arms flailing, rusted blades scraping ice. The others snarled in a voice like cracking glaciers, smashing them aside. Sam realized he had to do something drastic. He recalled the Black Tome's mention of a binding ritual that might lock a white or other in place. It was dangerous, uncertain, but he had no choice. He fell to his knees, ignoring the biting cold, and pressed his bloodied hand to the ground. He muttered a short incantation, pouring his last reserves of will into shaping the wards around the White Walker. If it worked, the presence might be contained. If it failed, he would be exposed. His voice trembled through the swirling snow. The White Walker felt the shift. It turned its head sharply toward Sam. An unearthly shriek tore from its throat as it sensed intangible shackles forming. For a heartbeat, Sam thought he had succeeded. The other stumbled, frost swirling around its form. Then it glared at Sam with unholy fury. With a sudden lunge, it shattered the forming wards, hurling a wave of cold that knocked Sam onto his back. Pain lanced through his ribs as he slammed into the frozen ground. The White Walker loomed over him, sword raised, shimmering like ice under the pale sky. Sam tried to roll away, but he was sluggish from exhaustion. The Watchers were too far, the skeletons too slow. He stared up at the towering figure. He was going to die. In a moment of heartbreaking clarity, he thought of Gilly, of baby Sam, of John, of everything he had tried to protect. His own folly had led him here. The White Walker's sword whirled down. Sam twisted aside, the blade biting into the ground next to his shoulder, sending shards of ice and earth flying. A blur of movement. Dickon barreled in on foot, having lost his horse in the melee. He carried a sword of castle-forged steel, likely useless against the other's magic, but brandished it anyway. With a shout, he swung at the White Walker. The other parried with contemptuous ease, then kicked Dickon away. Sam heard his brother grunt as he hit the ground. The White Walker raised its sword again to finish Sam. Cold terror locked his muscles. He might have tried to summon a skeleton or recite a final incantation, but his mind was too scattered. This was the end. A flash of movement from behind the White Walker. Lord Rowan, riding a half-lame horse, thrusting a spear tipped with dragonglass. Where he had gotten it, Sam couldn't say. Perhaps they had distributed a few. The spear struck the White Walker's flank. The other howled, dropping to one knee as black cracks spiderwebbed through its icy flesh. It turned, swinging desperately, but Rowan yanked the spear free and stabbed again. Then the White Walker shattered, dissolving into shards of ice that scattered on the wind. Sam gasped for breath, every limb shaking. Rowan slid off his horse, helping Sam to his feet. The battlefield around them was still raging. Another White Walker retreated into the swirling mass of whites. Dickon coughed and stood up, wincing, pressing a hand to his bruised side. The skeletons continued to fight, clashing with the whites in a gruesome dance of undeath. Sam reached out with his mind, reinforcing control, driving the skeletons forward. The White Walkers, seeing their advantage slip, apparently decided to withdraw. One gave a long, piercing shriek. The whites began falling back, dragging their half-rotted limbs. The skeletons pursued relentlessly for a time, but Sam called them back, not wanting to be led into a trap. By nightfall, the enemy was gone, leaving behind a plain strewn with broken bodies, shattered bones, and swirling snow drifts darkened by blood. Fires burned across the field as men tried to warm the wounded and burn the white corpses. Sam stood with Dickon and Rowan, numb. They had won, or at least survived, but at a terrible cost. Hundreds of living soldiers lay dead or dying. More than half the skeletons had been dismantled or scattered, though Sam might reassemble some if given time. Each victory felt like a step deeper into hell. They camped among the ruins of Harrenhal's outskirts that night. The men were too exhausted to properly fortify the position. Some simply collapsed where they stood. Sam took a small corner near a broken wall, huddling with a blanket. He listened to the moans of the injured, the frantic whispers of those who realized just how bad it was. The Watchers also huddled nearby, occasionally checking that Sam was still conscious. Without him, the skeletons would crumble. In the small hours, Dickon limped over to Sam, lowering himself gingerly. His face was bruised, lips split. Snow clung to his cloak. He looked at Sam with an expression that mingled gratitude and deep sorrow. "You're still alive," he said quietly. Sam nodded, voice hoarse. "Thanks to Rowan and you. Are you injured?" Dickon shook his head. "Just battered. I thought we were finished." They both gazed at the meager embers of a dying fire. After a moment, Dickon asked, "Was that the largest White Walker force we'll face?" Sam exhaled softly. "I doubt it. They seem to have more, especially if Winterfell hasn't fallen yet. The worst is yet to come. Dickon's gaze hardened. Then we keep going. No matter what. If we can't get to Winterfell in time, we at least need to coordinate with any other forces that remain. Dorne, the Stormlands, the Vale. Someone must still be fighting. We can't do this alone. Sam had no answer. He felt the presence in his mind stirring, fed by the monstrous battle. Using necromancy so extensively seemed to awaken a dreadful part of the world's magic, as though ancient powers reveled in the bloodshed. He was at once the orchestrator of it and enslaved to it. Even if they triumphed over the White Walkers, Sam wondered if he could ever purge this darkness from his soul. They pressed on, forging a path of blood and ice through the riverlands. Each new skirmish with Whites tested the Legion's resilience. The Watchers grew more adept at reassembling skeletons in the field, but each incantation tested Sam's waning strength. More than once, he collapsed in the aftermath, only to be revived with mulled wine or forced rest. Some nights, the men whispered that Sam Tarly was half dead himself, that his eyes shone with an unholy light when he commanded the skeletons. He overheard them but did not dispute it. He felt the changes within him. They encountered small pockets of living survivors, a battered group of knights from House Fry trying to hold the twins, a cluster of peasants hiding in the ruins of a September. Most wanted nothing to do with the Bone Legion, but desperation forced them to accept any offer of protection. The scouts reported that the main White Walker host was still north, locked in battle near Winterfell or drifting across the open plains. Despite losing some Whites, the others' numbers seemed endless. The land itself was dying under a relentless winter. At last, after what felt like a lifetime of marching through cold and death, Sam and the battered host of the Reach stood on a ridge overlooking a wide valley in the north. The black shape of Winterfell's walls rose in the distance, half obscured by swirling snow. Smoke drifted from inside the castle, as if from fires or burning wreckage. The fields around it were a churned wasteland of ice and corpses. It seemed the fight had raged for weeks. Dickon and the other lords conferred. They decided to attempt a direct approach, praying the living inside the castle still held the gates. If not, they would have to lay siege to an undead-infested ruin. Sam felt a lump in his throat. He had not known if he would truly make it back here. Beyond those walls, perhaps Jon Snow still lived. Perhaps Daenerys Targaryen's dragons soared overhead. Or maybe they had all perished. The cavalry advanced first, picking their way across the frozen terrain, standard-bearers at the fore. The skeletal legion followed behind, an eerie wave of bone gleaming faintly in the pale light. Sam rode near the front, mind locked on controlling the undead. Closer they came until they could see movement along the battlements. Men or Whites, Sam could not tell at first. Then a horn sounded from the walls, echoing over the silent expanse. A battered banner flew atop Winterfell, a direwolf against a field of white. The gates creaked open a sliver, and a party of riders emerged, waving a makeshift flag of truce. At their head rode none other than Jon Snow, though Sam barely recognized him at first. His face was drawn, his hair flecked with frost, and he wore black armor dented in countless places. But his eyes widened at the sight of the living host from the Reach. Then he spotted Sam, and for a moment, an expression of disbelief mingled with relief and confusion. They met on the field before the gates, the wind biting at their cheeks. Jon dismounted, stepping forward. Sam slid from his saddle as well, nearly collapsing from exhaustion. Jon gripped Sam's arms, searching his face. Neither spoke at first, the swirl of memories and horrors too vast. Finally, Jon broke the silence. "Sam, what have you done?" Sam felt tears threatening. He glanced back at the legion of skeletons, standing in ragged ranks behind the cavalry. I did what I thought necessary," he whispered. "I'm so sorry, Jon." Jon's gaze flickered with shock, sorrow, perhaps a hint of gratitude that Sam was alive at all. But the moment was cut short by the next wave of urgency. A woman in furs approached, Daenerys Targaryen, pale and fierce, her silver-white hair braided tight, her expression etched with fatigue. She looked upon the skeletal army and took a step back in alarm. Others joined them. Knights, northern lords, even some wildlings. All wore the same battered look. This was a garrison on the brink of collapse. Dickon and Lord Rowan approached, greeting John stiffly. They had never met him before. John's voice was hoarse as he explained that the others had attacked Winterfell repeatedly, that the living had barely LD on thanks to the castle's fortifications and the dragons, though only 2 remained, each wounded. One was indeed lost to the White Walkers. They had inflicted massive casualties on both sides, but a final assault loomed, for the others were mustering an overwhelming force not far off. Daenerys nodded, adding that she had seen the Night King riding a creature of ice and death in the skies beyond the forest. Dickon informed them of the undead legion Sam commanded, and their intent to stand with the living in this final stand. John's face tightened with pained understanding, but also fear. "We'll accept any aid," he said quietly. "But gods help us. What dark road have we all walked?" The living host of the Reach and the battered defenders of Winterfell merged that day, forging the largest coalition the North had seen in ages. Wildlings, Northerners, Southerners, and a legion of bone. Daenerys's dragons soared overhead, screeching defiance, though they were wounded and less agile than before. Sam and John shared a quiet moment on the ramparts, looking out over the snowy fields. Sam recounted his journey, the dread magic, the moral cost. John said little, but he placed a hand on Sam's shoulder in solace. The next day, they prepared for what might be the final battle. Word spread that the Night King himself would soon approach, leading an army as large as any had faced. Winterfell's walls bristled with archers and sharpened stakes. The skeletons arrayed outside in lines, ready to clash with the oncoming whites. Jon coordinated with the Watchers on how best to use them. Daenerys, though wary, accepted Sam's undead as a necessary evil. People prayed to the old gods, the new, the drowned god, any deity that might listen. Snow fell steadily, dusting armor and turning the fields into a white graveyard waiting to happen. At dawn, horns sounded. A pale sun revealed the horizon crawling with shapes. Tens of thousands of whites, maybe more. Among them, White Walkers tall and silent, mounted on dead horses. In the sky, a shape glided. A monstrous dragon of ice, once Viserion, now the Night King's steed. The Watchers along the walls shuddered. Daenerys's living dragons roared in reply, though one had tattered wings. The final conflict beckoned. Sam joined Jon, Dickon, Daenerys, and the other leaders atop Winterfell's gatehouse. He had placed the skeletons under a standing order to hold the line, to protect the living. The Watchers stood by with backup wards. Sam clutched the parapet, exhausted, but determined. If the realm fell now, everything was lost. The White Walkers would cloak Westeros in eternal night. The enemy advanced like an unstoppable tide. Whites, shrieking and flailing, hammered into the skeleton legion. The Watchers activated the wards. Sam's mind reeled with the effort of controlling so many at once. The skeletons fought back, hacking and stabbing. The living catapults hurled fire, scything through ranks of undead. Daenerys's dragons swooped down, spewing flame that immolated hundreds of whites in a single pass. But the ice dragon met them in the sky, unleashing a freezing blast that turned flames to steam, rending scales. Jon and Daenerys, from the battlements, watched in horror as the dragons clashed overhead. The fight on the ground was beyond anything Sam had witnessed. Thousands upon thousands of whites battered the skeletons. The field became a seething mass of writhing corpses, bones splintering, men shouting. Sam felt the White Walkers attempt again to wrest control of the skeletons, but this time he was ready, aided by Watchers who chanted protective verses. The wards glowed, pushing back the others' influence. Yet for every wave of whites the skeletons cut down, more swarmed in. The living soldiers joined the fray, forming shield walls behind the skeletons, stabbing at any white that broke through. Wildlings fought alongside men of the Reach, while northern bannermen fired arrows from the walls. Slowly, the White Walkers advanced. Sam sensed their cold presence pressing in from all sides, trying to envelop the entire battlefield in a deathly chill. High above, Daenerys's black dragon locked jaws with the ice dragon, spiraling in a deadly dance. Flames and frost erupted in the sky. Jon cursed under his breath. If the ice dragon prevailed, it would be the end. Sam could hardly keep track of it all. He poured every shred of will into commanding the skeletons to hold formation, to block the whites from reaching the gates. A creeping numbness spread through his limbs, as if the necromancy demanded more than just mental effort, but life force itself. The hours blurred. The tide of whites seemed endless. The watchers fell, one by one, devoured or frozen by White Walkers. Sam found himself alone in his efforts, tethered to thousands of undead. He swayed on the gatehouse, blood trickling from his nose. Voices shouted around him. Dickon tried to snap him from his trance, but Sam could barely respond. The White Walkers hammered at his mind, 1,000 ice shards threatening to pierce his soul. Then, a furious roar shook the heavens. The living dragon soared overhead, smashing into the ice dragon in a final, desperate collision. They crashed to the ground outside Winterfell's outer wall, the impact sending shockwaves of snow and debris. Daenerys and Jon cried out. Sam was nearly flung from the rampart. When the snow settled, the ice dragon lay in pieces, black blood and frost steaming from its wounds. The living dragon was mortally wounded, but it had dealt a fatal blow. Above the wreckage, a dark shape rose. The Night King himself, dismounted, fury radiating from his eyes of blue flame. A wave of silence fell across the battlefield. Even the White Walkers seemed to pause. The Night King strode forward, raising his arms in a grotesque mimicry of the gesture Sam recognized, the raising of the dead. Every corpse on the field, white or skeleton, trembled. Sam felt the bond threaten to unravel. If the Night King overcame him now, the Skeleton Legion might be seized by the Great Other's champion. In that moment, Sam realized the final confrontation was at hand. The Watchers were gone. No one else could help him hold the wards. Jon scrambled down from the gatehouse, presumably to face the Night King with his Valyrian steel sword. Daenerys tried to guide the dying dragon for one last attack, but it could barely move. Summoning the last shreds of will, Sam clutched the stone parapet. The wards flickered. He realized that if the Night King succeeded in wresting control of Sam's legion, tens of thousands more would be added to the White Walkers' ranks, ensuring the living's defeat. There was only one way to prevent it. Sam had to sever the necromantic bond entirely. That meant sacrificing the entire skeleton force, in effect unmaking what he had done. But it also meant they would lose their main line of defense. Perhaps the living could rally. Perhaps Jon could kill the Night King. Sam had no time to weigh options. He saw the skeletons beginning to twitch and turn, some pivoting to face the living. If he hesitated, it would be a massacre. With tears burning his eyes, Sam roared words of dismissal, the same final incantation he had used in Old Town to destroy the Bone Legion. He repeated them 3 times, voice cracking with pain and desperation. He felt the presence recoil, felt the Legion waver, as though uncertain. Then, in a colossal release of magic, the necromantic cords snapped. One after another, the skeletons collapsed into piles of bone, strewn across the field. The whites among them stumbled, momentarily confused. Sam nearly blacked out from the effort. Cheers and cries of horror mingled from the living lines. They had lost their undead allies but simultaneously thwarted the Night King's attempt to seize them. Now the field was strewn with inert bones. The whites still teemed, but it seemed many had been destroyed, and the White Walkers themselves had taken losses. Jon charged across the corpse-riddled plain, determined to face the Night King. Daenerys's dragon gave one last feeble roar, spewing a final gout of flame. The Night King raised an icy spear. Sam watched, heart pounding, powerless from the rampart. In that last moment, the battered living rallied. Daenerys somehow clambered atop a wrecked tower, seizing a dragon-glass-dipped spear of her own, hurling it with all her might. Jon, from another angle, lunged with long claw, the Valyrian steel blade, slicing at the Night King's flank. The White Walkers tried to protect their master, but the combined assault was too swift. Jon's strike bit into the Night King's side, black cracks spiderwebbing outward. Daenerys's thrown spear lodged in its chest. A keening wail tore through the battlefield as the Night King convulsed, then shattered into drifting shards of ice. In that instant, the White Walkers who remained shrieked and dissolved, their whites collapsing like puppets with cut strings. A stunned hush settled over Winterfell. The biggest threat was destroyed. The sky began to lighten, as though the darkness gripping the land lifted ever so slightly. Men dropped to their knees, sobbing with relief or grief or both. Sam could scarcely believe it. The Night King was gone. The White Walkers were defeated, though the cost was enormous. Dazed, he climbed down from the gatehouse, staggering onto the battlefield. His eyes roamed over the shattered bones of what had been his undead legion. He had undone his greatest sin, or so he hoped. Jon and Daenerys met him among the ruins. They looked exhausted, battered. Jon wore a bleak expression, as though uncertain whether to celebrate or mourn. Daenerys stood tall, but her eyes glistened with sorrow for her fallen dragon. Around them, the living forces of the North and the Reach tried to gather the wounded. The war was not truly over. There would be rebuilding, pockets of whites might remain. Yet the great Other's champion, the Night King, was destroyed. Dickon appeared, limping, tears on his cheeks. He embraced Sam, ignoring the stares of men around them. "We're alive," he whispered, half in disbelief. "You saved us, brother, by destroying what you created." Sam nodded numbly. "I couldn't let the Night King have them. I couldn't let them become part of his horde." Jon stood near them, shaking his head. "We've paid a terrible price, but maybe now Westeros has a chance." He eyed Sam with deep concern. "What will you do now?" Sam shook his head. He looked at the piles of bone that had once marched under his command. He remembered the nightmares, the presence in the darkness. "I don't know," he admitted, voice cracking. "I only know I can't ever do this again. Cost too much, too many lives lost. And my soul, I don't know if I can face Gilly or anyone. But perhaps if the realm can rebuild, maybe I can find a way to make amends." Daenerys stepped forward, surprising Sam by placing a hand on his shoulder. "You gave us another fighting chance, Samwell Tarly. I don't claim to understand your sorcery, nor do I condone it. But your sacrifice here, we are in your debt for what that is worth." Sam looked at her, at Jon, at the swirling snow around them. He thought of the future of a shattered Westeros, but a living one. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that, in the end, justified all the horror he had wrought. Or maybe nothing could ever justify it. He was too weary to dwell on it now. He just sank to his knees, letting the snow soak his breeches. Somewhere in the distance, men shouted with ragged victory. The White Walkers had been cast down. In the days that followed, Sam wandered in a fog of exhaustion. The living worked tirelessly to burn the remaining whites, to bury the dead with what honor they could muster. Jon and Daenerys organized supply lines to feed the survivors. Word spread across Westeros that the Night King was no more, though pockets of undead still lurked. The dawn seemed a little brighter each morning. Lords from the Reach who had joined the cause were hailed as heroes, though many had lost their lives. Dickon Tarly tried to keep the Tarly banner afloat, forging alliances with the new power in King's Landing, whoever that might be, as the realm's politics were in disarray. Sam never quite found peace. Each night, he dreamed of chanting in the catacombs, felt the intangible presence pressing on his soul. He suspected it would never fully leave him. Yet he had learned something crucial, that the living, however fractured, could unite against the dark, and that some lines should never be crossed, no matter how desperate the need. Even if, for a moment, crossing that line might seem to save them all. When, at last, the snows began to melt and the living turned to rebuilding, Sam quietly gathered what few possessions he had left. He said his farewells to Dickon, who embraced him solemnly. Jon tried to convince him to stay, at least for a while, but Sam demurred. "I need to find Gilly," he said, voice quivering. "I need to see if she'll forgive me for everything I've done." John nodded, clasping Sam's hands. He looked away, blinking back tears. "Safe travels, Sam." Sam offered a half-smile. "You as well, Lord Commander or King in the North, or I'm not sure what title you prefer now." John gave a small, humorless laugh. They embraced as brothers one last time. Soon after, Sam departed Winterfell on a sturdy mare, alone save for a few supplies. He rode south, past fields that had once been battlefields, past villages ravaged by winter. The warmth of the sun felt foreign on his face after so much cold. He thought back on the horrors he had seen and caused. People might someday sing of how Samwell Tarly raised an undead army to save Westeros, or they might revile him as a necromancer who flirted with damnation. He felt no pride in it, only a heavy sorrow and a quiet hope that at least some good had come of his dark knowledge. Each night on the road, as Sam made camp, he watched the stars and thought he sensed them shining a little brighter. Perhaps the gods had turned their gaze away during the long night, but now they peered back with cautious curiosity, judging the battered realm's attempts to rebuild. Sam prayed they would find hearts strong enough to persevere without needing black sorcery. He prayed for forgiveness, though he knew he might never fully grant it to himself. And so the man who had once been called Ser Piggy, the coward of the Night's Watch, the Maester's student, the reluctant necromancer, rode on. He did not know what the future held. But with the Night King gone and the dead mostly laid to rest, there was, at last, a chance for spring. Perhaps, in time, Sam could find a measure of peace or redemption. And though the memory of what he had done would always haunt him, he carried with him a lesson the realm should never forget, that some powers are better left unknown, but when the darkness is deepest and all hope seems lost, even the gentlest of men might dare the blackest arts, if it means giving the living a chance to survive. He urged his mare onward, leaving footprints in the slowly thawing ground. Far behind him, the smoke from Winterfell's chimneys rose into a pale sky, a silent monument to a victory whose cost would echo through history. Sam set his eyes on the road ahead, determined to find Gilly and prove that even after all he had done, love and life could still endure. And in the quiet hush between wind gusts, it seemed the land itself exhaled, relieved to be free, if only for a time, of the horrors of the long night.